Hey gorgeous people, tonight we're talking about a woman who started with 4 creams, a borrowed kitchen, and absolutely zero intention of staying small. No investors, no connections, no family money, just an iron will, a freakishly sharp instinct for what women actually wanted, and a talent for walking into a room and making everyone feel like they already needed what she was selling. We're talking about Estée Lauder, the woman who basically invented modern beauty as a business, and did it while everyone else was still figuring out what business even meant. Here is the wild part. She did not discover a miracle formula. She did not get lucky. She just refused, and I mean stubbornly, spectacularly refused, to accept that a girl from Queens with immigrant parents and no fancy degree had any ceiling above her head. Spoiler alert, she was right. What she built went from a repurposed restaurant kitchen to a global empire worth over $100 billion, and the tactics she invented along the way, the entire beauty industry still uses them today, whether they admit it or not. So before we get into it, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching this from. What city? What country? What time is it there? I genuinely want to know who is showing up for this one. Now get comfortable, because this story is wilder than any perfume commercial ever let on. Let's go. To understand how Estée Lauder built one of the most powerful beauty companies on earth, you have to start somewhere that feels completely at odds with the glamour she eventually sold to the world. You have to start in Corona, Queens, not the glamorous part of New York, not Manhattan with its soaring skylines and department stores dripping in silk scarves. Queens, specifically the corner of it that, in the early 1900s, was essentially a holding pen for people who had just survived an ocean crossing and were now trying to figure out how electricity worked. This was the neighbourhood where Josephine Esther Mentzer was born in 1908, the youngest daughter of a Hungarian immigrant family, and absolutely none of that sounded like the beginning of a dynasty. But here we are. The Corona neighbourhood at that time was the kind of place where ambition was considered either admirable or delusional, depending entirely on who you asked. It was dense, noisy, and alive with the particular energy of people who had given up everything familiar and were now building something new from scratch, mostly with their hands and a lot of stubbornness. The streets smelled like bread from the bakeries, motor oil from the repair shops, and the general industrial cologne of a city expanding faster than it could manage itself. It was not, to be blunt, a place that screamed luxury skincare. And yet, her father, Max Mentzer, ran a hardware store on the ground floor of their building, which is perhaps the least glamorous foundation imaginable for a future beauty empire. He was a practical man who dealt in practical things: nails, screws, paint, the kind of merchandise that was supposed to solve real and immediate problems. Max was well-liked and hard-working, the kind of immigrant success story that measured itself in inventory turnover and rent paid on time. He was not, by any surviving account, particularly preoccupied with aesthetics beyond making sure the shelves were straight. That particular obsession came from a different source entirely. Josephine's mother was a woman named Fanny, and Fanny Mentzer was something of an anomaly in a neighbourhood that was largely focused on survival. She'd come from Europe with the same general baggage everyone else carried: limited resources, a foreign accent, and an enormous capacity for hard work. But she also had something slightly unusual for the circumstances, which was a genuine and almost devotional interest in how she looked. Not vanity in the careless, frivolous sense, but something closer to discipline, a daily practice, a ritual she performed every morning with the quiet seriousness of someone who understood, instinctively, that the way you presented yourself to the world was a form of communication, and she intended to be very clear about what she was saying. Every morning young Josephine watched her mother stand at the small mirror in their apartment, above the hardware store where the sound of customers filtered up through the floorboards, and transform. It was not a dramatic transformation. There were no theatrical gestures or elaborate tools. It was methodical. The careful application of creams to her face and neck, the deliberate movements of her fingertips working the product into her skin in small, firm circles, the way she would study her reflection not with dissatisfaction, but with something more like assessment. She was not criticizing herself, she was problem-solving, and when she was done, she looked different. Not unrecognizably so, but noticeably. She looked polished. She looked, in the very specific and intentional sense of the word, put together. In a neighbourhood where women her age often looked visibly worn by the accumulated weight of laundry, cooking, child-rearing, and general economic anxiety, Fanny Mensah looked like someone who had made a deliberate choice about how to meet the day. For a small child watching this, the lesson was not about vanity. The lesson was about agency, about the gap between what is and what you can make it. Josephine was absorbing, without anyone explaining it to her in those terms, the idea that your appearance was not simply something that happened to you. It was something you could actively shape. It was a tool. And tools, as the daughter of a hardware store owner surely understood at some foundational level, were for solving problems. The problem, as Josephine saw it even then, was the world as it existed. The solution, she would spend the rest of her life refining. This might sound like an exaggeration. The kind of tidy origin story narrative that gets polished and smoothed over decades of retelling until every rough edge disappears and everything connects perfectly to everything else. And certainly in the version Estée Lauder later told about herself, the origin story did get quite a bit of polishing. But the core of it, the observation of her mother's daily ritual and the absorption of the idea that beauty was not passive but active, that it was something you did rather than something you were given, this was real. It showed up too consistently in her later behaviour, her methods, her instincts, to be simply invented. The mirror in that Queen's apartment taught her something that no business school class would have been able to articulate quite so effectively. What made the neighbourhood itself formative in ways beyond the domestic was the texture of immigrant life in Corona in those years. The community was almost entirely working class, with a population that had recently arrived from southern and eastern Europe, Hungary, Italy, Poland, and was navigating the peculiar American experience of being simultaneously proud of where you came from and quietly ashamed of not yet being what you were trying to become. There was a persistent and almost universal anxiety about status, about how you were perceived by the people who had been here longer, who spoke without an accent, who wore better clothes. This anxiety was not spoken about openly, but it was ambient. It was in the air. And one of the things it produced, predictably, was an intense attention to the signals you sent through your appearance. Clothes, hair, skin, these were not decorative, they were strategic. Josephine grew up steeped in this logic. In a world where you had limited control over your economic circumstances, your background, your accent, or the neighbourhood you lived in, your appearance was one of the few variables you could actually manage. This was not a lesson that required explicit instruction. It was learned by watching and living. And Josephine watched carefully. She watched her mother, and she watched the other women in the neighbourhood. And she developed an early and quite sophisticated understanding of what made the difference between a woman who commanded a room and a woman who disappeared into the wallpaper. It was rarely the most objectively beautiful woman who commanded attention. It was the woman who moved through the world as though she had decided beforehand how the interaction was going to go. This quality, this proactive and almost aggressive intentionality about presence, was something Josephine was already practicing in childhood in the particular way that unusually driven children practice things, constantly and on anyone who would hold still long enough. She gave her classmates unsolicited beauty advice. She offered to help neighbourhood women with their skin routines. She was, by most accounts, an extremely sociable child who was also, just slightly, the kind of person you did not necessarily want to make eye contact with if you were in a hurry and owned a face, because she was going to have opinions about it. This was not entirely welcome by everyone she encountered, but she did not appear to find that discouraging. The family dynamic itself contributed to who she was becoming. Josephine was the youngest of Max's children from his second marriage to Fanny, and the family structure was, like most large immigrant households of the era, somewhat organised around the older children bearing more responsibility, while the younger ones had slightly more room to be themselves. Josephine had siblings who went to work, siblings who helped run the store, siblings who were already slotted into the practical machinery of family survival, and then there was Josephine, small and observant and perpetually interested in things that were not strictly necessary but seemed, to her, extremely important. She was not neglected exactly, but she was also not the one the family's primary economic attention was focused on, which meant she had the peculiar freedom of not being particularly constrained. She read whatever she could find about beauty and skincare, which in the early decades of the 20th century was not an enormous library, but was more than you might expect. There were women's magazines, advertisements, the occasional pamphlet from a cosmetics company that had started to understand that women might actually enjoy receiving information, rather than simply being told they were inadequate, and here was the product that would fix it. Josephine absorbed all of it, with the focused hunger of someone who recognized that this information was, in some important and not fully articulable sense, hers. That it was pointing towards something she was supposed to do. She just did not yet know exactly what that would look like. The transition from watching to doing began, as so many transformative things do, with a relative. Specifically with a man named John Schatz, who was her mother's brother, or depending on which source you consult, her mother's half-brother, which in practical family terms made him her uncle, and who was about to become, entirely without planning it, one of the most consequential people in the history of the American beauty industry. He just would not get any credit for it, which was, as we will see, somewhat typical of how his contribution to the family ended up. John Schatz was a chemist, not a famous one, not one whose name appeared in scientific journals or whose work was studied in universities. He was a working chemist, the kind of person whose expertise was practical rather than theoretical, and who made a modest living applying that expertise to products that real people could buy and use. He had a small operation in New York that he called New Way Laboratories, which is the kind of name that sounds considerably more impressive than the reality it described, which was essentially a compact workspace where one man and a small number of formulas produced a rotating selection of creams, lotions, and treatments for skin. It was not glamorous, it was not particularly lucrative, but it worked, in the specific sense that the products he made were actually good, actually effective, and actually did what he said they would do. This, it turned out, was rarer than it should have been. The beauty and cosmetics industry of the 1920s was not, to put this gently, a rigorous place. It was a landscape of extraordinary promises attached to products of extremely variable quality, sold with tremendous confidence and backed by virtually no science. Creams were bottled and labelled with names implying miraculous results, and the actual formulations behind those names range from genuinely effective to essentially useless to, in some memorable cases, actively harmful. Regulation was minimal. Consumer protection existed mainly in theory, and the women who bought these products were operating largely on faith, on the recommendation of a friend, or on the pure persuasive power of whoever was doing the selling. Into this environment, John Schatz had arrived with something unusual. He actually knew what he was doing. His creams were formulated with a real understanding of how skin worked, how ingredients interacted, what concentrations were effective versus ineffective, and what the difference was between a product that moisturized skin and one that simply sat on top of it and smelled nice while evaporating. He was, in the vocabulary of his era and field, a craftsman. He took formulation seriously in a way that most of his contemporaries did not, largely because most of his contemporaries were primarily interested in selling, rather than in the technical accuracy of what they were selling. Schatz cared about both, which was slightly unusual, and which meant that his products had a quality that was not entirely common. They worked. Young Josephine started spending time at her uncle's laboratory somewhere in her mid-teenage years, which would place it roughly in the early 1920s. The exact timing is not something the historical record agrees on with precision, because the historical record on John Schatz is, to be somewhat diplomatic about it, sparse. The corporate narrative of the Estée Lauder company has never been particularly eager to shine a spotlight on his contribution, for reasons that will become clear shortly. But the essential shape of what happened is not seriously disputed. Josephine Menzer became a regular presence in her uncle's workspace, and he taught her. What he taught her was not a single lesson, or a single formula. It was a comprehensive education in the practical chemistry of skincare. He showed her how emulsions worked, how to combine oil and water phases in the correct proportions and the correct sequence to create a stable cream rather than a separated, unpleasant mess. He explained what different ingredients actually did, which ones softened skin, which ones created a protective barrier, which ones helped other ingredients penetrate more effectively. He taught her the difference between a formulation that delivered results and one that merely created the sensation of delivering results, which were not, he emphasized, the same thing. He also taught her something that went beyond chemistry. He taught her how to talk about skin. This second education was arguably more important than the first, though Josephine would not have understood that yet. Schatz had developed, in his years of working with customers and clients, a vocabulary for skin, a way of looking at someone's face and describing what he saw, what the skin needed, why it was behaving the way it was, and what could be done about it. This was not clinical language. It was accessible, conversational, and reassuring. It communicated expertise while making the person on the receiving end feel understood rather than diagnosed. It was, though nobody would have used this phrase in 1922, extremely good customer service. And Josephine, who had already been practicing unsolicited beauty commentary on her classmates for years, took to this vocabulary immediately. She began doing something in those years that she would continue doing, in various forms, for the rest of her professional life. She would take whatever product her uncle had made, apply it to someone's face, talk them through what it was doing and why, and then watch their reaction. She was studying the transaction. Not the commercial transaction, not yet, but the emotional one. What happened in a person when someone paid careful attention to their face? When someone touched their skin with confidence and purpose and explained, in clear and validating terms, that they could see exactly what was going on and that there was something to be done about it. What happened, she was discovering, was that the person transformed. Not their face, not yet. Their posture changed. Their expression changed. They became, in some indefinable but extremely visible way, more present, more themselves, more hopeful. This observation was going to become the engine of everything that came after. But first, Josephine had to get her hands on the actual formulas. Schatz was generous with his knowledge in the way that people who are genuinely passionate about something tend to be generous. He shared freely because sharing was how he expressed his expertise, and because he was teaching his niece in the comfortable assumption that this was a family undertaking. There was apparently no formal agreement about what she could do with what she learned. There was no contract, no discussion of intellectual property, no conversation about what would happen if Josephine decided to take these formulas and repackage them under her own name and sell them independently. These were not the kinds of conversations that happened in working-class immigrant families in the 1920s, partly because the legal framework for such conversations was still relatively undeveloped, and partly because nobody in John Schatz's position was imagining that his nephew's quiet, attentive teenage daughter was going to build a global corporation on top of what he was teaching her. He should perhaps have been imagining that, but hindsight is, as always, a luxury. The formulas Josephine eventually took and renamed and began selling were not inventions she had developed independently. They were, in the clearest factual sense, her uncle's work, his years of experimentation and refinement, his understanding of what made a good cream good. She renamed them Super Rich All-Purpose Cream, 6-in-1 Cold Cream, other variations that she would continue developing and adjusting over time. The names she gave them were hers. The marketing instincts she brought to them were entirely hers. The relentless personal salesmanship with which she pushed them into the world was, beyond any question, hers alone. But the underlying science, the formulations that actually made the products work, those came from a small laboratory in New York run by a man whose name appeared on none of the eventual packaging. Whether this constitutes theft is a question that depends enormously on who you ask and which legal or ethical framework you are applying. The simplest version is that it was absolutely a transfer of value without compensation or credit. Schatz gave Josephine an education and the formulas that came out of years of his professional work, and she converted that into a business that eventually made the Lauder family extraordinarily wealthy, while Schatz remained, for most of his life, essentially invisible in the story. That is a pretty clean description of what happened, and it is not flattering. The more complicated version acknowledges that family knowledge transfers in working-class immigrant communities rarely came with contracts and attribution requirements, that the lines between teaching and giving were genuinely blurry, and that Josephine did not simply take the formulas and reproduce them unchanged. She developed them further, combined them with a completely different kind of commercial instinct, and added the human dimension of her sales approach in ways that transformed them from workshop products into something the market had not seen before. She was not, in other words, simply a copyist. She was an adapter and an amplifier, which is a different thing, though the difference does not entirely resolve the ethical problem. What is not in dispute is that John Schatz essentially disappeared from the narrative. In the official story of Estée Lauder, he is present only as a faint shadow, a vague reference to a family member who had some interest in chemistry, mentioned briefly and then set aside. The mythology that the company built preferred a different story. A lone visionary, a self-made woman, an entrepreneur who created something from nothing. The nothing in this story was doing a lot of work. There was quite a bit of something that it was covering up, and that something had a name and a laboratory and a set of formulas that formed the literal chemical foundation of the early Estée Lauder product line. The erasure was not, probably, a single deliberate act. It happened gradually, the way these things usually happen, through years of telling a story in a particular way and finding that the story worked better without certain complications. Schatz himself does not appear to have made any significant public claim on what he had contributed, which may have been a matter of temperament, or of family loyalty, or of simply not having anticipated how large the thing his formulas had seeded would eventually grow. By the time it was enormous enough that his contribution would have been worth fighting for, the narrative was already set and the window for changing it had quietly closed. Josephine, meanwhile, was learning things in that small laboratory that would define her approach for decades. One of the most important was something she absorbed more through observation than explicit instruction: the relationship between touch and trust. When her uncle applied a cream to a customer's skin, he did it with deliberate, confident movements. He was not hurried. He was not apologetic. He was precise, and that precision communicated competence in a way that no description of the product could have matched. A person who touches your face with confidence is, on some pre-rational level, a person you trust with your face. Josephine watched this and understood it in her bones. She also began to understand something about the psychology of the women who came to see her uncle. They were not primarily coming for a cream. They were coming for the experience of being attended to, of being the subject of expert, careful attention, of having someone look at their face and see, rather than overlook, what was there. In 1920s America, women's experiences of being genuinely seen by professionals in any field were not exactly abundant. A doctor looked at you and told you what was wrong with you. A beauty counter might sell you something you had not asked for. John Schatz did something rarer. He looked at a person's face and engaged with it as a puzzle worth solving, and he communicated that the solving of the puzzle was something he found genuinely interesting. His customers came back. They told their friends. He had built, with no marketing whatsoever and no particular business acumen, a small but loyal following based almost entirely on the quality of the experience he provided. His niece was taking extremely careful notes. She was also, during this period, practicing on anyone who would let her. Neighbours, friends, the women she met through various social circles, anyone who expressed even mild interest in their skin or their appearance became, in Josephine's orbit, a subject for demonstration. She would arrive with her uncle's creams, repackaged into jars she had prepared herself, and she would give facials. She would talk through what she was doing and why. She would explain the ingredients in terms that were accessible, but conveyed seriousness. She would be, in every interaction, intensely focused on the person in front of her, in a way that felt flattering because it was genuine. She was interested in their skin because she found skin genuinely fascinating, and people can tell the difference between someone who is performing interest and someone who actually has it. What she was doing, without the vocabulary or the business plan to describe it as such, was building a customer base, or more precisely, she was building a network of people who had experienced her attention and trusted her. In a field where trust was the scarcest resource and the hardest to manufacture, she was accumulating it through the most labor-intensive method imaginable, one face at a time. This was not a scalable model by any conventional definition. You cannot build a global empire by personally touching every customer's face. But it was establishing something that would be scalable, a reputation, and a set of instincts about what women wanted from a beauty interaction that were grounded in actual experience rather than theoretical marketing logic. The formulas she was working with continued to evolve. She was not a passive transmitter of what Schatz had created. She experimented, she adjusted, she added ingredients and removed them. She refined the textures and the scents, and the way the products felt on skin. She had absorbed enough of the underlying chemistry to make meaningful changes, and she was applying to the formulas the same focused attention she applied to everything else that interested her. By her early 20s, the products she was selling were a hybrid, rooted in her uncle's foundational work, but shaped by her own modifications and instincts. They were, in that sense, hers in a way they had not been when she first took them. Whether that evolution was enough to constitute independent creation is a question that remains somewhat open. What is clear is that she was becoming very good at selling them. She had found, through years of practice, a sales style that was entirely her own, direct but not aggressive, expert but not condescending, personal without being intrusive. She made each interaction feel like a discovery rather than a transaction. She was selling not just cream, but the experience of having someone who knew things about skin tell you specifically what your skin needed, and then show you. This was, in the context of the early American beauty industry, fairly revolutionary. Most cosmetics were sold to women by showing them an idealized image and implying they should want to look like it. Josephine was selling something different. She was selling the idea that a woman's actual face was the interesting thing, that there was something there worth attending to, and that with the right knowledge and the right products, she could be not a lesser version of someone else's ideal, but a better version of herself. This framing was, as a piece of marketing psychology, brilliant. It was also, as a personal philosophy, complicated, because it depended on the premise that women's faces required fixing, that their natural state was a problem in need of a solution. But within the commercial logic of the era, Josephine's approach was distinctly more humane than the alternatives. She was not telling women they were inadequate. She was telling them they were interesting. She was telling them their skin had a story and she knew how to read it. The fact that the story always ended with a product for sale was, to be fair, not unique to her, but the way she told it was. By the time she was in her early 20s, working out of whatever space was available, selling at local salons and beauty shops and social events, and occasionally just wherever she happened to be when she encountered a receptive face, Josephine Menzer had developed the core of what would eventually become the Estée Lauder method. She had the products, sourced initially from her uncle's formulations and continuously developed from that foundation. She had the sales technique, personal, knowledgeable, attentive, and almost impossibly persistent. She had the instinct for what women wanted from a beauty interaction, and she had the willingness to give it to them in a way that felt almost uncomfortably personal, which it often was, but which also worked. What she did not yet have was scale, or capital, or the name that would eventually be on the packaging of products sold in 150 countries. But she was working on all of it. She was working on all of it with the same methodical, relentless, slightly terrifying focus that had been on display since she was old enough to stand at her mother's mirror and understand that what she was watching was not just a woman getting ready for the day. It was a woman deciding who she was going to be. And that, it turned out, was a lesson worth learning very, very carefully. The world outside that Queen's apartment was not waiting for her. Nobody was holding a space open. Nobody was expecting a daughter of Hungarian immigrants with no formal training in business or chemistry or marketing to arrive and rearrange the furniture of an entire industry. The beauty business in the 1920s and early 1930s was already occupied by larger personalities and larger budgets. Helena Rubinstein, Elizabeth Arden, Max Factor, companies that had established themselves and were not particularly interested in making room. The market was not exactly empty, but Josephine had learned something from watching the way her uncle's small laboratory competed with larger operations and held its own. The products had to be genuinely good, and the person selling them had to make the customer feel that the product had been chosen specifically for them. Not for women in general, for this woman, right now, with this skin, in this moment. That was the idea she was carrying out of Corona Queens and into whatever came next. It was not a business plan. It was not a brand identity document or a go-to-market strategy. It was a conviction, held with the particular solidity of something that has been tested repeatedly and found to be true, that the way to sell something to a person was to make the person feel that you understood them better than anyone else who had ever tried to sell them something. The creams were the delivery mechanism. The understanding was the product. John Schatz, working quietly in his New Way laboratory, had given her the mechanism. What she did with it afterward was entirely her own invention. To appreciate just how much she had absorbed and how quickly, it helps to understand the broader landscape of beauty and skincare in the 1920s, because it was a landscape that rewarded audacity above almost everything else. The industry was young, loosely regulated, and deeply strange in ways that are difficult to fully convey. Cosmetics companies made claims about their products that would today result in immediate legal consequences and probably several furious news segments. Creams that promised to restore youth, dissolve wrinkles, feed the skin with secret European mineral compounds, repair the damage of aging using technologies that were either highly proprietary or entirely fictional. The consumer had almost no way of knowing which was which. The word of the seller was essentially the only available information, and sellers, having recognized this, were not inclined toward understatement. Into this environment, The products Josephine was selling had a peculiar advantage. They actually worked. Not magically, not in the way the most extravagant claims of the era would have suggested, but in the very real and underrated sense that they did what good skincare is supposed to do. They moisturized, they protected, they improved texture over consistent use, and they did not make things worse. In an industry where making things worse was a not entirely uncommon outcome of applying the wrong product, this was a genuine competitive edge. The women who used her uncle's formulations and then the formulations she had built on top of them noticed results. Not miracles, results. She had also, by this point, developed a particular gift for the follow-up. After selling a product to someone, Josephine would circle back. She would ask how the cream had been working, whether they had noticed a difference, whether they were applying it correctly. This was not standard practice. Most salespeople of the era operated on a transactional model. Exchange product for money, move to the next customer. Josephine treated every sale as the beginning of a relationship rather than its conclusion. She was interested in the outcome because the outcome was the next sale, yes, but also because she was genuinely curious whether what she had told the customer was correct. She was running informal field trials. She was gathering data. She was not thinking about it in those terms, but that is what she was doing, learning what worked, on which kinds of skin, under which conditions, and adjusting her recommendations accordingly. This gave her, over years of practice, a depth of practical knowledge that was unusual for someone without formal training. She had treated enough faces and followed up on enough results to have a fairly sophisticated understanding of what different skin types needed and how different ingredients behaved in different conditions. She understood, for example, that what worked beautifully on dry winter skin might be excessive in summer humidity, and she adjusted what she sold accordingly. She understood that older skin behaved differently from younger skin, in ways that were not simply about which direction the wrinkles pointed. She understood that diet, sleep, stress, and general life circumstances showed up in the face in ways that were useful to acknowledge when talking to a customer about their skin, partly because it was accurate and partly because acknowledging that someone's tired skin reflected the difficulty of their life was, in its way, a form of emotional recognition that was not nothing. Women, she had noticed, did not come to a beauty counter merely to buy a product. They came because the beauty counter was one of the few places where someone with apparent expertise would look at them, specifically and carefully, and engage with what they saw. In the world of the 1920s and 1930s, this was a surprisingly rare experience for women of the working class. Doctors looked at them when they were sick, employers looked at them when they needed something, husbands had their own preoccupations, but here was someone willing to stop, look at your face as though it mattered, and offer something specific and useful in response. The emotional transaction underneath the commercial one was significant. Josephine felt this, understood it, and built her entire method around it. She was also, though it would take years for this to become fully visible, building something else, a personality. She was constructing, through the accumulation of small choices about how she presented herself, how she spoke, what she wore, how she carried herself in a room, a persona that was related to but not identical with the girl from Corona. She was becoming, through deliberate effort, a different kind of presence, more polished, more authoritative, more the sort of person who belonged in the kinds of rooms she intended to enter. This was not dishonest exactly, or at least it did not begin that way. It was a natural response to understanding that the world she was moving toward had certain expectations, and that meeting those expectations required becoming someone who could meet them. Every immigrant family understood this logic at some level. Josephine was simply applying it with more precision and more ambition than most. The name change came later, and it is worth noting as a preview of the larger pattern. Josephine Esther Mentzer eventually became Estée Lauder, a name that sounds considerably more French than the reality of its origins, which were about as French as the Corona hardware store. The accent over the first E was a choice. The soft, continental quality of Estée was a choice. The last name Lauder came from her marriage, but the way she leaned into the sound of it, the way she associated it with a certain kind of European sophistication, was a series of deliberate decisions made by someone who understood that the name on the packaging was also a product, and that this particular product should suggest worlds that a girl from Queens had not grown up in but intended to occupy. None of this was visible yet in the early years. She was still finding her footing, still selling out of whatever situation presented itself, still learning the rhythms of an industry that had not yet sorted itself into the organized structures it would later develop. But the essential elements were in place. She had the products, better than most of what the market was offering. She had the technique, personal and attentive in a way that created loyalty. She had the ambition, which was a quality she had never been short of for a single day of her life. And she had, perhaps most importantly of all, the absolute certainty that where she was could not be where she stayed. That certainty was its own kind of capital. In an era when working-class immigrant women were not exactly swimming in options for economic advancement, it was also, honestly, a fairly audacious thing to be walking around with. The beauty industry in 1930s, America was not an obvious path to wealth and influence for someone without connections, money, or a prestigious degree. Helena Rubinstein had done it, Elizabeth Arden had done it, but they had been doing it for decades by the time Josephine was starting, and the landscape they had navigated was considerably less crowded than the one she was entering. The argument could be made that the timing was bad. Josephine characteristically did not appear to find this argument compelling. She was standing in the early 1930s at the threshold of a series of decisions that would determine whether everything she had learned and practiced and developed would remain a local operation of modest proportions or become something else entirely. The formulas in her jars were good. The relationships she had built were real. The instincts she had developed over years of personal selling were sharp and original and, in their specific combination, unlike anything else in the market. The only remaining question was what she was going to do with all of it, and whether she had the nerve to do it at a scale that would actually matter. History, as we know, eventually answered that question. But the answer was not obvious yet, and it was not inevitable, and the path between the kitchen laboratory in Corona and the counters of Saks Fifth Avenue was neither short nor straight. It ran through some interesting territory, including a marriage that was almost as strategically constructed as it was romantic, a product launch that would rewrite the rules of an entire industry, and a set of sales tactics so relentlessly personal they made competitors deeply uncomfortable. All of which is exactly where this story is going next. The story of Josephine Mentzer becoming Estée Lauder is, in one sense, a story about products and markets and a particular genius for selling. But it is also, if you follow the timeline carefully, a story about a woman who approached every dimension of her life, including the personal ones, with the same strategic intelligence she applied to everything else. Which brings us to Joseph Lauder, who would eventually become Joseph Lauder, which was a small adjustment with a large symbolic function, and who was about to become, somewhat unknowingly, one of the foundational elements of a business he did not yet know he was helping to build. They met in the early 1930s, when New York was not exactly in its most glamorous phase. The Depression had not been subtle about announcing itself. Across the country, businesses were collapsing, savings were evaporating, and the general mood could be described as grim with occasional flashes of desperate ingenuity. In this environment, Josephine was still selling creams, which might seem like a strange time to be in the luxury-adjacent beauty business, except that it was not strange at all when you understood something she had already grasped. Women who could afford almost nothing else would still find a way to afford a small jar of something that made them feel better. Lipstick sales went up during the Depression. Skincare held steadier than most industries expected. The instinct to take care of your appearance did not disappear when money did. It intensified. Josephine knew this. Joseph Lauder was not a man of particularly dramatic origin either. He was an immigrant's son, a practical, steady, financially literate man who worked in business and had the rare quality of being genuinely good at the things that genuinely bored his future wife: accounting, manufacturing logistics, the patient management of numbers that told you whether what you were doing was working or slowly killing you financially. He was not flashy. He was not the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately rearranged its social dynamics. He was the kind of man who walked into a room, found the most efficient path to wherever he was going, and got there without anyone particularly noticing. In most professional contexts, this would have been unremarkable. In the specific context of Josephine's life and ambitions, it was, without either of them fully understanding it yet, exactly what she needed. They married in 1930, and their first son, Leonard, was born not long after. By most external measures, this looked like a conventional early chapter in a conventional story. Immigrant background, modest circumstances, a young family in New York navigating an economic crisis with grim determination and some degree of optimism. The unconventional part was happening in the margins, in the gap between what the marriage looked like and what Josephine was actually building while it existed. She was still selling. She was still working on products, refining formulations, expanding her network of women who trusted her recommendations. She was, in the specific vocabulary she would have used herself, always working. Joseph was supportive, in the way that a man who has a practical relationship with reality supports a spouse who has a vision. He understood that the work was serious, that it was generating something, and that it was probably going to be the shape of things going forward whether or not he had strong opinions about it. The marriage lasted through most of the 1930s before it didn't. The divorce in 1939 is something the official biography of Estée Lauder handles with the brisk efficiency of a paragraph you read and then move past, because the official version of the story would prefer to focus on the eventual reunion and the eventual business triumph rather than on the years between. But the years between are interesting, because they reveal something about the way Josephine operated when she had complete freedom to pursue what she wanted without the structure of a domestic partnership around her. She moved to Florida, which in 1939 was a destination that attracted people who were either very wealthy, very hopeful, or actively trying to reinvent themselves. Josephine was primarily the third category, though she was not opposed to the company of the first. Miami in the late 1930s had a social scene that was, by the standards of the era, fairly vibrant. Hotels, restaurants, wealthy winter residents from the Northeast who arrived each year with money to spend and social lives that needed maintaining. This was not a bad environment in which to sell cosmetics. It was also not a bad environment in which to develop a particular set of social skills that Josephine was already practicing and would continue to refine for the rest of her professional life. The ability to move through rooms full of people who had more money and more established status than she did, and to make herself in those rooms someone worth knowing. She socialized deliberately in Miami. She made herself useful and visible in the specific social infrastructure of expensive hotels, charity events, and the kind of gatherings where wealthy women spent long winter afternoons in the company of other wealthy women discussing things that were not particularly important. She demonstrated her products, made up faces, offered advice. She was performing the role of an expert, which she was, and she was doing it in rooms that she did not yet belong to, but was steadily making herself familiar in. This was not dishonest exactly. She was a genuine expert. But there was also, in the way she navigated those Miami rooms, a quality of deliberate positioning that went beyond simply sharing her knowledge. She was building a clientele that had social cachet, and social cachet was, she understood, a product just as much as a cream was. She also, during this period, had relationships with men who were wealthier and more socially connected than she was. The historical record on these relationships is not extensive, partly because Josephine was always careful about what she allowed into the record, and partly because this was simply how significant portions of women's lives in that era were lived, in the half-light between what was happening and what was discussable. What is clear is that she was not, during the years between her marriages, primarily focused on finding a romantic partner. She was focused on building access to rooms, to networks, to the kind of information you only get when you are close to people who have it. That this was her primary orientation during a period that most women of her era would have been expected to spend in somewhat more conventionally domestic directions says something about the scale of what she was actually thinking about. The return to Joseph in 1942 is, in retrospect, the moment that clarified everything. She had spent 3 years in Florida being as socially strategic as the environment allowed, and she had learned something valuable from it. What she needed was not a wealthy patron. She had met enough wealthy patrons. She had seen how that relationship worked, what it produced and what it cost, and she had made a clear-eyed assessment of the bargain on offer. A wealthy man's support came with a wealthy man's expectations, and those expectations had a tendency to encompass the entirety of a woman's professional life and redirect it toward the management of his social comfort. This was not a business plan. This was a constraint dressed up as an opportunity. Joseph Lauder was different, and the difference was precisely what she came back for. He was not wealthy. He was not socially connected in any way that gave her access to rooms she could not already enter. He was not going to introduce her to anyone important or underwrite her ambitions with family money. What he was, and what no amount of Miami socializing had turned up as an alternative, was a person she could actually build something with. He understood business in the practical, unglamorous sense of the word. He understood manufacturing, the logistics of producing things in sufficient quantity that you could sell them in sufficient volume that the operation paid for itself and eventually grew. He understood bookkeeping in the way that people who have grown up without financial safety nets understand it, as a survival skill, not a bureaucratic inconvenience. He had, most importantly, the temperament for the part of building a company that required patience rather than performance. And performance, Josephine had plenty of. Their remarriage in 1942 was, by every available account, a genuine partnership in a way the first marriage had not quite been. Because the first marriage had been entered into before Josephine had a fully articulated understanding of what she was building. The second one was entered into with clarity on both sides. He knew what she was doing. She knew what she needed. They divided the work with a cleanliness that most modern business partnerships would find enviable. She handled everything that touched the customer, every product decision, every piece of marketing logic, every personal interaction and demonstration and follow-up. He handled everything behind the customer, the production, the suppliers, the finances, the operational machinery that had to exist for any of her customer-facing work to produce results rather than just goodwill. This is the part of the Estée Lauder story that gets somewhat flattened in the telling, because the romantic version of a business empire founded by a singular genius is more compelling than the accurate version, which involves two people with complementary skills making sensible decisions about division of labor. Josephine was unquestionably the architect of everything that made the brand what it was: the products, the positioning, the relentless personal sales philosophy, the instinct for what women wanted and how to give it to them. But Joseph was the reason any of that could scale beyond a one-woman operation. Without someone who could look at a production problem and solve it, without someone who could look at a balance sheet and understand what it was saying, the genius of Josephine's customer approach would have remained exactly what it had been in the 1930s. A small, local, personal business that produced loyal customers, but not a company. Joseph converted her brilliance into an entity with infrastructure. That is not a minor contribution, even if it is a less cinematic one. What the partnership produced, starting from that remarriage in 1942 and accelerating through the mid-1940s, was the architecture of a real operation. They set up production in a repurposed restaurant kitchen in Manhattan, which is the kind of manufacturing origin story that sounds charming in retrospect, and was almost certainly less charming in real time. Given that restaurant kitchens are not particularly designed for producing cosmetics, and involve a level of improvisation that would probably concern most modern regulatory agencies, they were not in a position to be precious about their facilities. They were in a position to make things work with what they had, which was, it turned out, plenty of experience with making things work. The products were good. They had always been good. The formulations that had started with John Schatz and been developed and refined through years of Josephine's practical testing were, by this point, genuinely excellent by the standards of the era. The super-rich all-purpose cream that became one of their early flagship products was not an exaggeration of its name, at least not by much. Women who used it noticed results. Women who noticed results told other women. This word-of-mouth network was the first engine of the business, and it was powered entirely by product quality, which is perhaps the least exciting thing to say about a company that would eventually become famous for its marketing genius. But it happens to be true. The marketing genius came next, and it came in forms that were, for the early 1940s, so far outside the normal parameters of how beauty products were sold that the industry would spend the next several decades either ignoring the implications or pretending it had thought of the approach independently. To understand what Josephine was doing that was different, you need to understand how beauty products were typically sold in that era, because the contrast is stark enough to be instructive. The conventional model was print advertising, a magazine page with a beautiful woman, an aspirational headline, a product name, and the implicit suggestion that purchasing the product would narrow the gap between your current appearance and the one pictured. This model worked, in the sense that it sold products, but it worked at a remove. It created desire from a distance. The woman seeing the ad was relating to an image, not an experience. She was being sold a concept, and concepts, while effective at generating interest, are considerably less effective at generating the specific and immediate trust that turns a browser into a buyer. What Josephine had understood, through years of personal selling, was that the most powerful sales moment happened not when a woman saw an image of what a product could do, but when a woman felt firsthand what a product could do. When she sat down and had the cream applied to her skin by someone who knew what they were doing and could explain exactly why each step was producing the sensation she was feeling. That moment, when the product was on her face, and someone who clearly understood skin was describing what was happening, that moment closed sales in a way that no advertisement had ever managed. It was not replicable at scale through any medium that existed in 1945, but it was replicable in person, and Josephine was willing to do it in person at a frequency and in a variety of locations that made her competitors mildly exhausted just to contemplate. Before diving into the mechanics of how she actually executed this, it is worth pausing on what the beauty industry looked like at the point when Josephine was entering it seriously in the mid-1940s, because the landscape she was entering shaped the specific ways her approach stood out. The dominant players were Helena Rubinstein and Elizabeth Arden, two women who had built competing empires out of sheer will and considerable business intelligence, and whose rivalry was so intense and so personal that they reportedly refused to enter the same room as each other for most of their adult lives. This was not exactly the warm, collaborative industry that aspiring founders today sometimes imagine the beauty business to have been. It was competitive, territorial, and not particularly interested in new entrants who did not have a compelling reason to take up space. Rubinstein and Arden had, between them, established the dominant model for prestige beauty: European-sounding authority, aspirational imagery, and a retail experience built around the idea that purchasing skincare was a form of self-improvement that separated you from lesser alternatives. Their advertising was polished, their packaging was elegant, and their marketing operated at the level of the image rather than the individual. They sold to women as a category. Josephine was about to sell to women as people. The difference was not subtle, but it was also not immediately visible as a competitive advantage, which is one of the reasons her competitors were slow to recognize what she was doing and slower still to imitate it effectively. She went to beauty salons, because beauty salons were where women sat still for extended periods and were already in a receptive frame of mind about things being done to their appearance. This was not a subtle observation, but it was an accurate one, and Josephine acted on accurate observations with a speed and consistency that elevated them from observations into strategy. She approached salon owners, offered demonstrations, showed their clients what her products could do during the gap between one treatment and the next. The salon owners got something of value to offer their clients at no cost to themselves. The clients got an experience they had not expected, and a product recommendation from a source, Josephine, who had just demonstrated compelling expertise on their actual face. Josephine got a sale, a new customer relationship, and a foot in the door of whatever social network the salon served. This was efficient in a way that paid advertising could not match. She also went to social events, which required a different kind of navigation because the gatekeeping was social rather than commercial. The women at charity luncheons and hotel receptions and the various seasonal events that comprised the social calendars of the women she wanted as customers were not necessarily in a frame of mind to be sold to. They were in a frame of mind to socialize, to be seen, to maintain the particular web of relationships that constituted their social lives. Josephine understood this, and she adapted. And she did not arrive at these events as a salesperson. She arrived as a guest, or at least as someone sufficiently similar to a guest that the distinction was not immediately obvious. She was charming and informed and interested in the people she met, all of which was entirely genuine, and she happened to have in her bag things that were relevant to conversations she happened to steer towards skin and beauty, and what was working and what was not. The free sample was her most powerful tool, and she wielded it with a generosity that sometimes alarmed Joseph, who was, not unreasonably, tracking what things cost. She gave product away constantly, not in small, cautious quantities that suggested reluctance, but in amounts that communicated confidence. If you're willing to give someone enough of your product to form a genuine opinion about it, you are implicitly claiming that the opinion they form will be favourable. Most cosmetics companies of the era were not making that claim with their sample sizes. Josephine was, because she believed it, and the belief was justified often enough to make the strategy work. The economics of this were counterintuitive in ways that took some explaining, and the explaining fell primarily to Joseph, who was doing the math and occasionally expressing what might charitably be called concern. If you give away product, you spend money producing something you receive no direct revenue from. In the short term, this is a cost. In the slightly longer term, if the product is good, and the woman who received it tells her friends, which she will because women with good skin do not keep the source of their good skin entirely to themselves, the cost converts to a revenue stream that significantly exceeds what you spent. The sample is not a giveaway. It is a marketing expenditure with a deferred and highly leveraged return. Josephine understood this not as a financial model, but as a human truth. If you give someone something real and valuable, they come back. And when they come back, they often bring someone with them. This logic was eventually formalized into what became known in the beauty industry as the gift with purchase model, and it is one of the most durable innovations in the history of retail. The structure is simple. Spend a certain amount, receive a free additional product or set of products as a bonus. The psychological mechanics underneath the structure are less simple but extremely powerful. The gift creates a sense of generosity from the brand, which in the transactional context of a retail purchase is an unexpected register to hit. It also creates urgency, because the gift is typically associated with a specific purchase threshold during a specific time period. And it creates a discovery mechanism. The gift often contains products the customer has not tried, which means the free item is also a sample, which means the gift is doing the work of two different marketing strategies simultaneously, while technically being only one. Every major beauty retailer in the world uses this model today. The gift with purchase is so embedded in the standard operating procedure of cosmetic counters that most shoppers have simply accepted it as a natural feature of the purchasing environment, like escalators or the strategic placement of perfume near the entrance. It does not occur to most people to ask where it came from or who invented it. The answer is that it came from a woman in early 1940s New York who was giving away jars of cream because she could not afford print advertising and had figured out that the thing she was giving away was more persuasive than any advertisement could be anyway. This is not an apocryphal story. This is documented history that the entire beauty industry has quietly absorbed and never particularly credited. The inability to afford advertising led to another decision that seems almost perversely counterintuitive from the outside but made perfect sense from inside Josephine's logic. When the company had accumulated enough capital to attempt a significant marketing push, they found themselves with approximately $50,000, which in the mid-1940s was not a small amount of money and was perfectly adequate to fund a meaningful advertising campaign in the kinds of publications that reached their target audience. They approached advertising agencies. The agencies, to their substantial subsequent embarrassment, were not particularly interested. The budget was not large enough to attract serious attention from the major players. The brand was not established enough to attract the kind of creative enthusiasm that produced good work. And Josephine was, by multiple accounts, a client who had very specific and strongly held opinions about how her products should be presented, which advertising agencies of that era were not always enthusiastic about accommodating. A client who knows exactly what she wants is, in the vocabulary of the agency business, not always the kind of client an agency finds most enjoyable to work with. So the $50,000 went somewhere else. It went into samples, into product that was given to women, applied to faces, taken home in small jars, experienced rather than observed. The advertising agencies who passed on the account did not know they were passing on the future standard of an industry. They thought they were passing on a small cosmetics client with an oddly strong personality and an insufficient budget. They were right about two of those three things. The samples moved through the social networks of New York and increasingly beyond it, through a mechanism that required no formal coordination. Women who experienced the product and found it worked told people they knew, and the people they knew went looking for the product, and the searching for the product created demand that began to have a shape visible from a commercial distance. This was not social media. There was no platform, no algorithm, no engagement metric. It was simply the oldest form of marketing that exists. A person who likes something tells another person. The difference between this and the general word of mouth that every product enjoys was that Josephine had engineered the initial experience so carefully, had made the personal interaction so specific and memorable and useful, that the telling was not vague recommendation, but detailed enthusiasm. The women she had worked with in salons or at events had a specific story to tell. This woman looked at my face and told me exactly what it needed, and gave me this cream and it worked. That is a more powerful recommendation than a magazine advertisement. And it costs nothing to spread once the initial interaction has happened. The efficiency of this approach was not universally appreciated by the people who encountered it in real time. Josephine was, to use a contemporary term that the 1940s did not have available, a very high-touch salesperson. She was persistent in ways that made some people uncomfortable and other people deeply loyal. She did not observe the conventional social distance between service provider and customer. She remembered the names of people she had met once at a party 6 months earlier. She remembered what their skin had felt like, what she'd recommended, and whether they had tried it. She followed up with a consistency that, depending on your relationship with being followed up on, was either impressive or slightly alarming. The women who became her customers were not people she had transacted with. They were people she had attended to, and the difference in those two verbs captures the essential nature of what she was offering. She was also, during this period, developing something that would become one of the signature features of the Estée Lauder brand, the language of scientific authority delivered in personal terms. She talked about ingredients not in the vague, aspirational way that most beauty marketing of the era employed, but with a specificity that implied genuine technical knowledge. She would explain what lanolin did, why a particular concentration of a particular compound was more effective than the alternatives, how the pH of a formulation affected its interaction with skin. She was not making things up. She actually understood what she was talking about, because she had spent years learning it. But the effect of this kind of explanation on a customer was something she had understood and was deploying deliberately. It converted the transaction from a purchase into an education, and people who have been educated about why something works are considerably more likely to remain committed to it than people who have simply been told it works. This combination, the sample as first contact, the personal interaction as conversion mechanism, the scientific vocabulary as commitment builder, and the follow-up as retention tool, was a complete marketing system assembled from nothing but observation and instinct. There was no book she had read that described this approach. There was no business school framework she was applying. She was working from first principles, from the accumulated experience of years of personal selling to individual women, and she was scaling those first principles by doing more of the same thing rather than by replacing it with something more conventional. The unconventional quality of the approach had a specific commercial implication that would not become fully visible until later. The customers it produced were extraordinarily loyal, women who had been through the Estée Lauder experience, who had been personally attended to, demonstrated to, followed up with, who had received the free sample and found it worked, and then been remembered by name the next time they encountered the brand. These were not casual purchasers. They were converts. They thought about the brand with an investment that went beyond the transactional, because their relationship to it was not transactional. It was relational, and the relational customer, as every business has eventually learned, is the most valuable kind there is. She comes back regularly, she brings other people, and she does not abandon the brand lightly because the brand is not merely a source of products, but a source of an experience she values. Joseph, tracking all of this from the operational side, understood what he was watching his wife build even when the daily numbers were occasionally alarming. The samples cost money. The personal selling was extraordinarily labor-intensive. The return on any individual investment of time or product was difficult to measure in any time frame shorter than several months. But the pattern was visible and it was upward, and the customers who were attaching themselves to this brand were not the kind of customers who compared prices and switched allegiance when a competitor offered a marginally better deal. They were invested. They were loyal in the particular way that people are loyal to something that has made them feel genuinely seen. That quality, that loyalty produced by genuine attention rather than advertising impressions, was worth an enormous amount. It just required patience to build and a willingness to do the uncomfortable, time-consuming, endlessly personal work of building it one face at a time. The scale of what this would eventually produce, the department store counters and the global distribution and the advertising campaigns with their carefully lit images in the most expensive magazines in the world, all of that was somewhere in the future. What existed in the mid-1940s was a husband and wife in a converted kitchen, a product line built on borrowed formulas and genuine expertise, a marketing approach that the industry had not catalogued yet because nobody had done it quite this way before, and an ambition that was already, quietly, and persistently larger than anything the operation currently visible could have suggested. The personal selling phase was not going to last forever, because there is a physical limit to how many faces one person can attend to in a day, and Josephine had already bumped against that limit enough times to understand it. The next step required something she had not yet achieved, presence in the kind of retail environment where the customers she wanted were already shopping. It is also worth noting something about what this period cost Josephine personally, because the business narrative tends to smooth over the texture of daily reality in favour of the eventual outcome. The work she was doing was genuinely exhausting by any measure. She was not clocking in at a counter and waiting for customers to approach. She was engineering encounters, creating context, traveling to wherever the relevant women happened to be, and then performing, at full attention and with full enthusiasm, for as many consecutive hours as her schedule allowed. She did not appear to believe in saving herself. She operated at the kind of intensity that burns through ordinary reserves, and the question of what refueled her appears to have had a simple answer: the work itself. When a sale worked, when a woman's face changed because she had been genuinely helped, when a skeptic became a convert and then brought 3 friends the following week, that produced something in Josephine that functioned as fuel. She was, in the most useful sense, energized by results in a way that allowed her to produce more of the conditions that generated results. She was also, during these years of intensive personal selling, building something that is genuinely difficult to quantify, but was possibly the most valuable asset she was accumulating. She was becoming extraordinarily good at reading people. Specifically, she was becoming extraordinarily good at reading what people wanted in the moment immediately before they knew they wanted it. She could walk into a room and within a few minutes identify which of the women there was the relevant conversation to be having. Not because that woman was necessarily the wealthiest or the most influential, but because that woman was, in some way that Josephine could detect without being able to fully articulate it, ready. Ready to be interested, ready to be demonstrated to, ready to believe that what was being offered was something that addressed something real. This capacity to identify the right moment and the right person was not something that could be taught in a sales training session. It was the product of thousands of hours of doing the work, and it made Josephine, by the mid-1940s, one of the most effective salespeople that the beauty industry had encountered, which was saying something because the beauty industry had its share of formidable personalities. There was also something she was developing that would eventually become one of the brand's most powerful tools: the counter demonstration. The idea of having a dedicated space in a retail environment where a trained person would demonstrate products on customers was not, in the 1940s, entirely unheard of. But the way Josephine imagined it was different from what typically happened, which was that a salesperson would hand you something and describe it while you stood at a polished surface and tried to imagine what it would do for you at home. What she wanted was something closer to what she did in the salons and at the social events: actual physical demonstration, hands-on skin, explanation in real time, the product applied and the result visible before the customer was asked to commit to anything. The counter, in her vision, was not a place where products were displayed and sold. It was a place where the personal selling experience she had been delivering in salons and at parties could happen at a slightly larger scale. The experience was the product, and the counter was the location where the experience lived. Getting a counter in the right kind of store, in a location that said something about where this brand belonged, was the immediate next step. She had been building toward this for years without perhaps fully articulating it in those terms, but the logic was clear. The customers she was developing through personal selling were a network, and networks have nodes, and the most powerful node would be a physical location in a prestigious retail environment that the network could visit and bring their friends to and think of as the place where this particular brand lived. She needed that location. She had a very specific one in mind, and she was going to get into it with the same combination of relentless personal contact and complete unwillingness to accept a final no that had characterized every other thing she had decided to do. She needed, in short, to get into a department store. She had her eye on a very specific one, and she was not going to stop until she had her answer. The store she had in mind was Saks Fifth Avenue, which in 1948 was not simply a department store in the way that most department stores were simply department stores. Saks was a statement. It occupied a specific position in the social geography of New York that had less to do with its square footage than with what it communicated about the people who shopped there. To have your product on a counter at Saks was to have the store's century of accumulated prestige flowing through your packaging. It was to be, in the most legible possible shorthand, legitimate. And Josephine, who understood the language of legitimacy better than most people who had actually grown up speaking it, wanted that counter with a clarity that approached the architectural. Getting it was not going to be simple, which was fine, because simple had never particularly interested her. The buyers at Saks were not, in the late 1940s, sitting behind their desks hoping that a woman from Queens with a husband in a converted restaurant kitchen and a product line of indeterminate financial standing would walk in and ask for shelf space. They were fielding requests from established brands, from companies with advertising budgets and distribution infrastructure and track records that could be examined by anyone who needed to examine them. Josephine had none of that. What she had was a product that worked, a story about why it worked that she could deliver with compelling authority, and a level of personal persistence that made it structurally impossible for her to interpret a first refusal as a final answer. She went to Saks. She asked to speak with a relevant buyer. The relevant buyer was not immediately available, because relevant buyers at Saks Fifth Avenue were not in the habit of making themselves immediately available to everyone who came in with a jar of cream and an ambition. She came back. She came back more than once. She brought product. She gave demonstrations. She was, by every available description, extremely difficult to get rid of in the specific way that people who do not experience rejection as information are difficult to get rid of. She kept showing up with the same fundamental proposition, adjusted each time by whatever new angle she had identified since the previous visit, and she kept doing it with the same level of cheerful, expert conviction that had been closing sales in salons and at social events for years. The buyer eventually agreed to a small order. The number that appears in the historical record is $800, which is not nothing but is also not an overwhelming vote of confidence from an institution the size of Saks Fifth Avenue. It was, in commercial terms, approximately a try-it-and-see approach, which is a perfectly reasonable approach when someone you do not know particularly well is asking you to give them space in a store that has a reputation to protect. A small order limits the downside. If the products do not sell, the cost is minimal. If they do, you have acquired a relationship worth developing. The buyer was being sensible. Josephine was going to be sensational. She prepared for that first Saks counter with the kind of attention that most people reserve for events of considerably greater ceremonial weight. She was not simply stocking a counter and leaving it in the capable hands of the store's staff. She was there personally, demonstrating, explaining, doing on Saks's retail floor exactly what she'd been doing in salons and at social events, touching faces, talking through what each product was doing and why, making each customer feel that the transaction had been designed specifically for them. The counter was not a passive surface where product waited to be noticed. It was a performance space, and Josephine was performing, in the very precise sense of delivering something rehearsed and calibrated to produce a specific response. The $800 of product sold in 2 days. This is the number that appears in every telling of this story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because 2 days is not a long time. 2 days means the product moved fast enough that people who came to the counter on the second day found it essentially gone, which created an immediate problem and an immediate opportunity simultaneously. The problem was that women who wanted the product could not get it. The opportunity was that women who wanted the product could not get it, which is a condition that, when it occurs naturally and visibly in a retail environment, produces something considerably more valuable than a sale. It produces urgency. It produces the particular social information that something is in demand, which is one of the most powerful drivers of desire that consumer psychology has ever identified. People want things that other people want. A sold-out counter communicates desirability more efficiently than any advertisement. Saks called to reorder. The conversation on the Saks side of that call was presumably somewhat different in tone from the conversations that had preceded Josephine's first order. She had demonstrated, with the most persuasive evidence available, that her products sold. Numbers tend to clarify relationships that personality alone had left somewhat ambiguous. What happened next was the decision that, in retrospect, looks like either inspired strategic genius or a very risky bet, depending on how you feel about leaving money on the table. Other retailers came calling. Word spread through the distribution networks of the beauty industry that there was a new brand at Saks that was moving product at an interesting pace, and the natural commercial response from buyers at other stores was to want in. Some of those stores were prestigious, but some of them were not. There were inquiries from drugstore chains, from discount retailers, from the kinds of outlets where a product's presence suggests accessibility rather than exclusivity. These inquiries represented revenue. They represented the kind of growth that the operational side of a small business, which is to say Joseph's side, might look at with some interest. Josephine said no, not to the prestigious stores, but to everything that was not prestigious. She refused the drugstores. She refused the discounters. She refused any retail environment that did not match or exceed the positioning of Saks, which meant she was, deliberately and systematically, limiting the number of places where her products could be purchased. This is not the obvious move when your primary concern is revenue. Turning down customers is counterintuitive in a way that produces real discomfort in anyone who has ever had to worry about whether a business is going to survive the next quarter. But Josephine was not in this decision thinking about the next quarter. She was thinking about what she was building and what it needed to be worth in 10 years. And what it needed to be worth in 10 years was not a widely available product. It needed to be something that women sought out, that required a specific kind of trip to a specific kind of store, that was not an impulse purchase available at the corner pharmacy between the aspirin and the cough syrup. The psychology she was applying here is not complicated, but it is powerful. Scarcity, even artificial scarcity, produces perceived value. A product that can be bought anywhere is a product that nobody is particularly surprised to see you using. A product that requires a visit to Saks Fifth Avenue is a product that, by the fact of its address, says something about the person who uses it. Josephine was not simply selling creams. She was selling a statement about the kind of woman who uses these creams, and that statement required a setting that supported it. The setting was the store, and the store had to be the right kind of store, and the right kind of store would not share shelf space with the cold medicine. This decision shaped the entire subsequent architecture of the brand, in ways that are still visible today. The Estée Lauder counter, wherever it appears, exists in a specific tier of retail, not because the products could not be manufactured and distributed more cheaply and broadly, but because the decision made in the late 1940s to treat the retail environment as a brand asset meant that every subsequent distribution decision was evaluated not just for its revenue implications, but for what it communicated about where this brand lived. This is, in the business vocabulary of the current era, a very sophisticated piece of brand management. In 1948, it was a woman from Queens deciding that she was not going to sell her products anywhere she would not want to be seen buying them. She also understood something about the department store counter that went beyond the prestige of the location. The counter, in her conception, was not a passive retail fixture where products sat and waited to be discovered. It was a stage. Every counter she opened was opened personally, and the opening was an event in the sense that something deliberate and considered happened there. She would arrive, she would set up, she would demonstrate, she would train the women working the counter in her specific approach, the touch, the vocabulary, the follow-up protocol. She was not merely placing product in a store, she was installing an experience, and she was installing it personally because the experience depended on being delivered in a particular way, and the particular way was hers. The counter openings became, over time, a kind of performance art in the very specific sense that they generated attention and created a social event out of what was, functionally, a retail launch. Women came to see what the new counter was, and they encountered Josephine, who was exactly what they found interesting. Confident, knowledgeable, intensely focused on the person in front of her, and in possession of products that she could demonstrate produced visible results. The counter opening was the advertisement, and it cost nothing except time, which Josephine had never been sparing with when the investment was likely to produce something useful. She trained her counter staff with the obsessive attention to detail of someone who understood that every interaction at the counter was either building the brand or damaging it, and that the brand had no advertising budget to compensate for counter experiences that left customers feeling dismissed. The women who worked her counters were expected to know the products the way she knew them, not just their names and their recommended usage, but their ingredients, their logic, the specific sequence of application and why it mattered. They were expected to touch customers rather than merely demonstrate at distance. They were expected to follow up. The Estée Lauder counter experience from the beginning was designed to replicate the personal selling approach she had developed over years of doing it herself, which meant it was designed to make each customer feel that the entire transaction had been constructed specifically for her. This required training that was genuinely unusual by the standards of retail employment in the 1950s. Most cosmetics counter staff of the era were expected to know their products and make a sale. What Josephine expected was closer to a professional level of skincare consultation, combined with an interpersonal warmth that did not tip over into false familiarity. Getting that balance right was difficult, and not everyone she hired could do it. The ones who could became the nuclei of the brand's expansion. The ones who could not found the job considerably more demanding than they had anticipated, which was, for them, a reasonable cause for surprise and for the brand a useful filter. The expansion through the early 1950s was steady rather than explosive, which suited the model. Each new counter was opened with the same personal attention, the same performance, the same installation of the specific experience rather than merely the product. The geographic spread was deliberate. The right stores in the right cities, building the network of women who had encountered the counter and converted to the brand, and who were doing, through their social networks, the distribution work that a larger advertising budget might otherwise have been needed for. The brand was growing through the loyalty it was producing, and the loyalty was the result of the experience, and the experience was the result of the distribution model that kept the brand in places where it could be delivered properly. It was in this period, with the Saks relationship established and expanding, and the brand beginning to accumulate the kind of presence in the prestige retail landscape that conferred its own momentum, that Josephine made the decision that changed the scale of everything. In 1953, she launched a product that was, on the surface, a bath oil. The surface, as was often the case with Josephine's decisions, was not where the interesting part lived. Youth Dew was its name, and the name was doing several things simultaneously. Youth was the most powerful word in beauty marketing, then as now, and positioning it as something you were dipping yourself into. A dew, a natural and fresh and gentle thing, was a piece of nomenclature that combined aspiration with sensory pleasure in the compact space of two words. The product itself was a concentrated, richly scented oil designed to be added to bath water, and it performed its cosmetic function effectively. But that was not why it changed the company. It changed the company because of where it sat in the social and commercial landscape of what women in 1953 were and were not permitted to buy for themselves. To understand this, you need to understand a peculiarity of the fragrance market in mid-century America that looks, from the current vantage point, both completely foreign and entirely recognizable. Perfume, in 1953, was a gift. Not exclusively, but predominantly. It was the thing a man gave a woman. It sat in the cultural category of romantic presents, alongside flowers and jewelry, and its price point, which could easily run to $50 or more for a bottle of something from a European house, reinforced its status as an occasion purchase rather than a routine one. Women wore perfume that someone else had chosen for them, and they wore it on the occasions when it seemed appropriate to wear something that someone had given them as a symbol of appreciation. This was a market structure that was, from the perspective of the fragrance industry, essentially fine. Perfume moved reliably as a gift item at Christmas and on birthdays and anniversaries, and the brands that sold it were comfortable with the rhythm this established. The problem with this market structure, if you happen to be interested in selling fragrance to women on a regular basis rather than twice a year when their husbands remembered to buy something, was that it removed women from the role of buyer. Women were the recipients of fragrance. Men were the purchasers. Women wore what they were given, or occasionally supplemented it with something modest and inexpensive that they allowed themselves as a small indulgence. But the serious fragrance market, the part where actual revenue lived, ran through men buying gifts rather than women buying for themselves. Josephine saw this and understood it as a structural opportunity of considerable proportions. If fragrance was positioned as a gift, women could not buy it for themselves without the transaction feeling either extravagant or slightly pathetic, neither of which was a purchasing emotion that generated repeat business. But bath oil was different. Bath oil was a functional product. It was a thing you used in a practical context, for a practical purpose, in the privacy of your own bathroom, without any of the social weight attached to dabbing perfume on your wrists before you went out. A woman could buy bath oil without it requiring a special occasion or a specific social interpretation. She was simply taking care of herself. This was, in 1953, a category that carried no particular cultural baggage. Youth Dew was both. It was a bath oil, which made it purchasable, and it was intensely, memorably fragrant, which made it function exactly like a perfume in all practical respects. It scented the skin, it persisted, it filled a room, it made the woman wearing it noticeable in precisely the way that good perfume was supposed to make someone noticeable. The price was $8.50, which was a fraction of what a comparable fragrance experience from a European house would have cost, and which placed it comfortably in the range a woman could spend on herself without requiring the kind of internal justification that $50 demanded. The market responded with an enthusiasm that the historical record describes variously as strong and as absolutely astonishing, and the truth appears to have been closer to the latter. In the first year, 50,000 bottles of Youth Dew were sold. This was a number that, For a family business operating out of converted kitchen facilities with no significant advertising budget, and a distribution network that was, compared to the established players, still quite limited, represented something close to a fundamental shift in the nature of the operation. 50,000 bottles is not a craft product number. 50,000 bottles is the beginning of a mass phenomenon. The repeat purchase rate was extraordinary. Women who bought Youth Dew bought it again. They bought it for themselves and they bought it as gifts, which was an irony that Josephine almost certainly noticed and appreciated. A product she had explicitly designed to bypass the gift market had become a gift item on its own terms, which meant it was capturing both the self-purchase market she'd opened and the gift market she had not abandoned. The fragrance industry, which had been comfortable with its existing structure, was watching something new happen in the bath oil category and not yet fully processing what it implied about the category they thought they owned. What it implied was that the gift market structure for fragrance was not a natural feature of the landscape. It was a convention that existed because no one had offered women a way around it that was attractively priced and culturally uncomplicated. Youth Dew was that way around it, and women took it with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this option and were delighted it had finally appeared. The convention turned out to be considerably more fragile than the fragrance industry had reason to hope. The financial impact on the Lauder company was not gradual. Youth Dew moved so much volume so quickly and with such a high repeat purchase rate that it fundamentally restructured the revenue picture of the business within a relatively short time. By the middle of the 1950s, Youth Dew was generating approximately 80% of the company's total revenue. 80% is a number that sounds like an exaggeration when you first hear it, and then you do the math on 50,000 bottles in the first year and compound it forward a few years, and it starts to sound, if not expected, at least explicable. The product had become the business, which was extraordinary, and also slightly precarious in the way that any situation where one thing is carrying 80% of the weight is slightly precarious. Josephine was not unaware of this. The concentration of revenue in a single product was a structural vulnerability, and she understood structural vulnerabilities the way someone who had been operating without a safety net for most of her professional life understood them, as things to be taken seriously and addressed rather than rationalized away. But before addressing it required expanding the portfolio, which was coming. The concentration of revenue in Youth Dew first had to do what it was doing: convert a small, well-regarded family beauty operation into a company that had the financial foundation to become something much larger. The production side of the business was under considerable strain. Joseph, who had been managing the manufacturing operation with the particular competence and patience that characterized everything he did on that side of the business, was now dealing with volumes that exceeded what a converted kitchen could reasonably produce. The Lauders had moved their production facilities by this point, but the scale of Youth Dew demand required further and faster scaling than had been anticipated. This was, in the specific lexicon of business problems, the good kind of problem. It was also genuinely difficult, and it required Joseph to move quickly on infrastructure that had previously been moving at a more modest pace. The fragrance composition of Youth Dew deserves a moment of attention because it was not accidental. The scent Josephine chose for this product was rich, warm, and persistent in a way that lighter, more conventional fragrances of the era were not. It was an oriental fragrance, in the industry terminology of the time: amber, spice, musk, the deep and lingering quality that did not evaporate within an hour, but stayed on the skin and on the clothes and in the room in a way that was impossible to miss. This was not a timid perfume wearing a bath oil costume. It was a bold, confident fragrance that announced itself and sustained itself, and that quality was a commercial choice as much as an aesthetic one. A fragrance this present and persistent was one that other people noticed and asked about, which meant every person wearing Youth Dew was potentially introducing someone new to the product in the course of an ordinary day. There was also something deliberate in the richness of the scent that spoke to a specific moment in the relationship between American women and European luxury. The post-war 1950s had produced a consumer class in the United States that was, for the first time at significant scale, able to afford things that had previously been available only to the very wealthy or to people who had access to European goods through travel or social connection. Department stores were stocking more international brands. The idea of European quality, particularly French quality in the fragrance and beauty categories, carried enormous cultural weight that American consumers were learning to aspire to. Youth Dew, with its rich oriental character, its serious staying power, and its Saks counter-address, positioned itself in that aspirational space without requiring the price of admission that actual European fragrance houses charged. It was accessible luxury in the specific form that the 1950s American consumer was most ready to receive it. Unmistakably high quality, genuinely sensuous, and priced so that buying it did not require a discussion about it. The repeat purchase that followed from this combination was not incidental to the product's success. It was structural. A woman who had committed to youth dew as part of her regular routine, who had incorporated it into the bath ritual that the product's format was designed to slot into, was not going to switch away lightly. The switching cost was experiential rather than financial. She would have to find something else that did what this did, and the combination of the scent quality, the concentration, and the skin conditioning function that good bath oil provides was not easily replicated by whatever generic alternative sat in the bath aisle at the local department store. Josephine had, without perhaps framing it in these terms, designed a product with built-in retention mechanics. The customer who loved it stayed loyal not because she was particularly brand-devoted in principle, but because the thing she had loved was genuinely difficult to replace. The word-of-mouth mechanism that had driven the personal selling operation in the previous decade was still operating, just in a different form. Instead of Josephine demonstrating a cream on a face at a salon, Youth Dew was being demonstrated continuously by every woman wearing it in every public space she occupied. Someone would ask what she was wearing. She would say Youth Dew. The someone would go looking for it and find it at the Saks counter, because it was not at the drugstore, because of the distribution decision made years earlier that had seemed counterintuitive and was now looking almost prophetically correct. The distribution decision and the fragrance character of Youth Dew were working together in a way that neither would have worked independently. The exclusivity directed interested buyers to the right counter. The fragrance quality generated the interest in the first place. The year 1953 sits in the Estée Lauder story as the hinge point between two versions of the company. Before Youth Dew, the company was impressive for its size and interesting for its methods. A family business that had developed a genuinely excellent product line and an unusually sophisticated approach to personal selling and distribution. After Youth Dew, it was something different. It was a company with momentum, with the financial resources to think seriously about expansion, not just the organic, careful, one counter at a time expansion that had characterized the previous decade, but real geographic expansion, line extension, the building of a brand infrastructure that could support a business operating at a significantly larger scale. The timing was also, though this required a particular kind of attention to notice, extremely well chosen. The 1950s in America were a period of rising consumer spending and a cultural emphasis on the domestic, on the home, on the rituals of personal care that were associated with femininity, and the presentation of an idealized version of domestic life. Women were being sold, by the culture in general and the advertising industry in particular, the idea that their appearance and the appearance of their homes were measures of their value and their character. This was a complicated set of cultural messages to navigate, and many women did find them complicated. But they also produced a consumer class that was oriented toward beauty products in a way that was unusually receptive to a company with excellent skincare and now a bath oil that let women do something pleasurable for themselves under the completely defensible label of personal care. Youth Dew met that cultural moment. It was the right product at the right time, which is partly a matter of luck and partly a matter of having paid close enough attention to the actual lives of actual women that you can see what they are ready for before they can articulate it themselves. Josephine had been paying that attention since she was a child watching her mother at the Mirror in Queens, and by 1953 she had been paying it professionally for nearly 2 decades. The result was a product that did not need to create desire from nothing. It found desire that already existed, desire that had no adequate object, and it gave that desire exactly what it was looking for. By 1984, 150 million bottles of Youth Dew had been sold. The number requires a moment. 150 million is not a niche fragrance story. It is not even a successful fragrance story. It is a cultural phenomenon that spans 30 years and continues to find new buyers while retaining old ones, which is the kind of longevity that most product launches do not even aspire to, because it seems too remote to be a realistic goal. Youth Dew achieved it because it was genuinely good, because it filled a genuine gap in what women could buy for themselves, and because the distribution model that kept it in the right stores made it feel, consistently across 3 decades, like something worth seeking out rather than something that had simply become ubiquitous. The company that emerged from the Youth Dew years was ready for the next thing, which was going to be considerably more ambitious than anything that had come before. The foundation was solid. Excellent products, a retail distribution model that conferred prestige on everything in the line, a customer base that had been built through personal attention and retained through loyalty rather than price competition, and now a fragrance that was generating the revenue to fund whatever came next. What came next involved an understanding of brand architecture that, for its era, was so sophisticated it would define how the entire prestige beauty industry organized itself for the following half-century. But that required a different set of moves, aimed at a different set of consumers, and built on an insight about brand identity and target audience that nobody in the beauty business had quite articulated yet. Josephine had the insight. She just needed the right moment to deploy it, and the right moment was nearly at hand. It is worth noting, before moving forward, what the totality of what had been built by the mid-1950s actually looked like when you stepped back far enough to see its shape. There was a product line that was genuinely excellent and growing. There was a distribution model that had been constructed with the specific purpose of making the brand feel worth seeking out. There was a sales methodology that had been invented from scratch, and was now being scaled through counterstaff trained to deliver an experience rather than simply execute a transaction. There was a fragrance-generating revenue on a scale that had not been anticipated and was now funding everything else. And there was the woman at the center of it, who had been building all of this simultaneously for years, while also being married and raising children and managing a household, and being, by most accounts, a fairly demanding person to share a life with if your primary interest was in a quiet, uncomplicated existence. Joseph, to his considerable credit, did not appear to have that as his primary interest. The company that Josephine and Joseph had built from a repurposed kitchen and a handful of formulas was, by the mid-1950s, a real business in every meaningful sense. It had revenue that compounded year over year. It had infrastructure, production capacity, a trained retail workforce, and the beginnings of a geographic footprint that was still mostly concentrated on the American market but was starting to attract the kind of attention that precedes expansion. It had a flagship product that was generating cultural conversation independently of any advertising. And it had something that no amount of money could purchase directly, but that the money was beginning to make possible: the position of being taken seriously. The prestige beauty market takes itself very seriously, which is one of its more reliable characteristics. The incumbents in that market, the established houses with their European heritage and their advertising weight and their decades of counter-presence in the right stores, had been watching the Lauders with the particular attention of people who are not quite sure whether what they are seeing is a threat or a curiosity. By the mid-1950s, the revenue numbers associated with Youth Dew had moved the assessment firmly into the threat category. What Josephine had done was not simply sell a lot of product. She had demonstrated that the logic of prestige beauty, the careful curation of where and how a brand was available, and the intensity of the personal relationship between brand and customer could be applied by someone who had built it from the ground up without the benefit of inherited prestige or European heritage or any of the other structural advantages that the established players had been relying on. She had shown that the advantages could be constructed. That was the most unsettling thing she had done, and it was only the beginning. By the mid-1950s, Josephine Esther Mentzer of Corona, Queens had essentially ceased to exist as a public figure. In her place stood Estée Lauder, poised, elegant, faintly European in manner and suggestion, possessed of a personal history that implied refinement without quite specifying where that refinement had been acquired, and in possession of a soft authority that made the women she encountered feel that they were in the presence of someone who genuinely knew things that they themselves did not. The transformation was remarkable. It was also, from the foundation up, a construction project. A very good one, executed over many years, maintained with the focused consistency of someone who understood that a personal brand, once started, required the same ongoing management as any other brand. You could not simply invent yourself once and then coast. You had to keep being the invented version, every day, in every room, with every journalist and socialite and department store executive who came close enough to ask a question you preferred not to answer honestly. The name change seems, on the surface, like a small thing. Josephine became Estée, which involves adding an accent mark over the first E and converting a perfectly pleasant Midwestern immigrant name into something that sounds as though it belongs on a bottle of Bordeaux. The accent was the choice. It was not a family tradition, not a regional spelling convention, not a tribute to any particular European ancestor. It was a decision made by someone who understood that the sound and appearance of a name carries cultural information, and that the cultural information she wanted to carry was not Queen's, 1908, but somewhere better, somewhere more interesting, somewhere that implied the kind of inherited sophistication that does not come from watching your father sell nails over a hardware counter. The accent turned a name into a persona. It was, as pieces of personal rebranding go, extremely efficient. One tiny diacritical mark and suddenly everything sounds more rarefied. If only the rest of identity construction were that simple. The last name had already been partially managed through marriage. Lauder became Lauder, a small phonetic adjustment that happened to move the name several rungs up the implied social ladder. Lauder is a perfectly acceptable surname that sounds, to an American ear, like a name from a specific kind of immigrant background. Lauder sounds Scottish. It sounds aristocratic in a way that is vague enough to be claimed and specific enough to be useful. The English have a Lauder who was a famous entertainer in the early 20th century, a beloved music hall performer named Harry Lauder who was knighted in 1919, and while Estée never directly claimed relation to him, the resonance of the name in the ears of people who had heard of him was not entirely unhelpful. Names are ambient. They carry associations that do not require explicit assertion. Lauder, in the context of a woman presenting herself as someone with European connections and refined tastes, simply worked better than Lauder. The fact that both names described the same person with the same background was the part that required active management. The management of origin was the more complex project, and it was one that Estée undertook with the thoroughness of someone who had thought carefully about which version of her history would be most useful in the room she intended to occupy. The rooms she was entering by the late 1940s and accelerating into through the 1950s were not the rooms of Corona queens. They were the rooms of the American social elite, of the wealthy women who summered in specific locations and wintered in others, and who had, as one of their more reliable social pastimes, the careful calibration of who was actually who. In these rooms, claims about background were not taken at face value, but they were not aggressively investigated either, because the social mechanics of the circles Estée was entering operated on a form of polite mutual agreement to accept the presented version of events as long as the presented version was sufficiently plausible and the person presenting it was sufficiently charming. Estée was sufficiently charming. She made sure of that. The origin story she presented to the press, to social contacts, to anyone who asked where exactly she came from and how exactly she had come to know so much about European beauty traditions, was one that varied in its specifics depending on the context but maintained a consistent atmospheric quality. There were suggestions of European aristocracy, of time spent among the skincare-conscious upper classes of the continent, of a background that implied exposure to a world of refined practice and inherited knowledge about beauty that working-class queens simply could not have provided. She was, in some versions of the story, something approaching a countess, or at least the implication was there, present in the telling without being spelled out in terms that could be directly contradicted. This is a very specific rhetorical skill, the ability to suggest a thing without stating it, and Estée had developed it to a considerable degree. She was not, technically, lying about having a title she did not possess. She was simply allowing an impression to form and then not correcting it. This is, technically speaking, a different thing from lying. Whether it is morally equivalent is a question that depends very much on your particular framework, and Estée did not appear to spend significant energy on that particular philosophical exercise. The social environment of wealthy American women in the 1950s was extraordinarily well calibrated for detecting certain kinds of imposters and remarkably blind to others. A woman who arrived without money and obvious family connections would be assessed. A woman who arrived with the right manner, the right vocabulary, the right instinct for how to behave in a specific setting, was admitted because the manner and the vocabulary were considered evidence of the background that produced them. Estée had spent years developing exactly this. A fluency in the social language of a world she had not grown up in, acquired through observation and practice, and the particular kind of social intelligence that comes from having had to pay close attention to how other people operated because your own instincts alone were insufficient for the terrain. She had been watching and learning since the salons of Miami, and what she had learned was, by the 1950s, expressed with sufficient naturalness that the learning itself was no longer visible. The European suggestion in her presentation was reinforced by the product itself, because the Estée Lauder brand had, from its earliest days, positioned itself in the atmospheric neighbourhood of continental refinement. The packaging was elegant. The language she used to describe her products, the vocabulary of ingredients and skin science that she had developed over years of practice, had a quality that implied access to knowledge that most American cosmetics companies did not communicate. American beauty brands of the era tended to be chirpy and practical and reassuring. Estée Lauder was authoritative and knowing and slightly exclusive in a way that suggested the authority came from somewhere specific, somewhere the customer had perhaps not been but instinctively respected. The brand's atmosphere and the founder's personal atmosphere were constructed to reinforce each other, which made both more convincing than either would have been alone. The birth year was a different kind of management. The historical record shows 1906, 1907, and 1908 all attached to Estée Lauder at various points, in various documents and interviews, and the variation is not explained by ambiguity in the records or any genuine uncertainty about when she was born. She knew when she was born. The variation was strategic, adjusted depending on what the context required. An older birth year was useful when a longer professional history was needed to support a particular claim about experience. A younger birth year was useful for other reasons that should not require extensive elaboration. Managing your age in public life is not an unusual practice, particularly for women in an era when aging carried specific professional implications that it does not quite carry today, at least not at quite the same intensity. What was unusual was the systematic nature of it, the maintenance of multiple versions across multiple documents, each serving a different function in the overall architecture of the persona. The effort involved in maintaining this level of consistency across decades and context is, if you stop to think about it, considerable. Every interview was an opportunity for inconsistency. Every new journalist who asked about her background was someone who might, if the answers did not align with previously published versions, notice the discrepancy. Every social introduction was a moment when the wrong detail, offered to someone who knew something Estée did not realize they knew, could create a crack in the structure. That none of these cracks became public for 4 decades is, in its own way, a testament to the quality of the construction. She was not only building the persona, she was actively maintaining it, the way you maintain any complex structure, through constant attention, through the immediate repair of anything that started to look unstable, through the absolute refusal to let your guard down in any context where the guard was necessary. The architecture is the right word for it, because what Estée was building was not simply a collection of false claims. It was a coherent structure, internally consistent and externally plausible, designed to serve a specific purpose, to make the space between who she was and who she needed to be, in the rooms that mattered, as small as possible. The prestige beauty market of the 1950s and 1960s was a landscape in which European origin, or the convincing suggestion of it, was a genuine commercial asset. Helena Rubinstein had leveraged her Krakow background into the identity of a continental expert. Elizabeth Arden had constructed a persona of cool, scientific authority. The market trusted European knowledge about beauty in a way that it did not quite trust American knowledge, which was considered more practical but less refined, more mass market but less elite. For someone trying to position a brand at the premium end of the market, the European association was not cosmetic. It was fundamental. Estée had something that neither Rubinstein nor Arden had needed quite so urgently. She was Jewish, the daughter of Hungarian Jewish immigrants, in an industry and a social world that maintained, through the 1950s and well into the 1960s, a set of unwritten but clearly understood restrictions about who belonged where. The American social elite that she was navigating had clubs that did not admit Jewish members, resorts that did not accept Jewish guests, professional and social networks that operated on the polite but firm assumption that certain people were welcome and others were not, and the people who were not were organized around a set of characteristics that included, prominently, being the children of Eastern European Jewish immigrants from Outer Borough, New York. The environment Estée was operating in was not welcoming to Josephine Mentzer of Corona, Queens. Estée Lauder of indeterminate but clearly sophisticated European origin was a different proposition. This context is essential to understanding what she was doing, because without it the persona construction looks like simple dishonesty, which is both reductive and somewhat unfair given the constraints under which she was operating. She was not inventing a false identity as a leisure activity. She was solving a structural problem that the world she wanted to enter had placed in her way, using the tools available to her, which happened to be her intelligence, her social skills, and her absolute willingness to be consistent about the version of herself she was presenting. She was also, it should be said, not alone in this practice. The American social landscape of the mid-20th century was full of people who had done versions of the same thing, who had adjusted names, smoothed regional accents, invented educational credentials, or simply allowed false impressions to stand uncorrected because the accurate version of their history was commercially or socially inconvenient. Estée was doing what many people in her position did. She was just doing it with more discipline and more success than most. It is worth noting, in the interest of full context, that both Helena Rubinstein and Elizabeth Arden had their own carefully managed versions of origin and identity. Rubinstein had arrived from Krakow but spent decades cultivating an air of continental European sophistication that owed as much to studied presentation as to actual biography. Arden had changed her name from Florence Nightingale Graham, which admittedly lacks a certain cosmetic authority, to something that sounded both aristocratic and modern, a combination that the beauty market of the early 20th century found considerably more compelling. The industry was built, in other words, on a foundation of managed identity. Estée was not introducing a novel practice to an innocent landscape. She was operating within an established convention, and doing it with more thoroughness than most of her predecessors. What distinguished her version of the practice was its comprehensive nature. Where other founders managed a name or smoothed a biography, Estée managed everything simultaneously: the name, the manner, the accent, the year of birth, the details of professional origin, the family background, the social positioning. It was a total project, managed at every level, with the consistency of someone who understood that a persona with inconsistencies was worse than no persona at all. A single visible crack would invite scrutiny of the whole structure. The structure, therefore, had no visible cracks, maintained through 4 decades of public life with a discipline that was, in its own way, as impressive as anything she achieved in the product or marketing side of the business. The French effect in her manner deserves particular attention because it was more than a stylistic flourish. The way Estée conducted herself in social and professional settings had, by the late 1940s, acquired a quality that was not entirely American. Not because she had spent significant time in France, because she had not, but because she had studied, carefully and deliberately, what European elegance was supposed to look and sound and feel like, and she had incorporated those observations into the way she moved through rooms, the pace at which she spoke, the way she handled a product, with the unhurried confidence of someone for whom quality is a given rather than a discovery. The slight formality of her social manner that coexisted with warmth in a way that Americans typically found either sophisticated or slightly baffling. She had, in other words, performed European refinement so consistently and for so long that it had become, in some genuine sense, who she was. The performance and the person had merged at the edges in a way that made the distinction between authentic and constructed increasingly difficult to locate. This is one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of what she built, and it sits at the center of a question that the beauty industry and the broader world of personal branding have been arguing about ever since. At what point does a performed identity become a real one? Estée Lauder had been Estée Lauder, consistently, for decades by the time anyone started asking pointed questions about Josephine Menzer. The woman who stood at a Saks counter in 1948, and the woman who was photographed at charity galas in the 1960s, and the woman who ran a global company in the 1970s, were all, in every observable sense, the same person. The architecture of the persona had proven durable enough to survive long enough that the question of its authenticity had become somewhat academic. She had made it true by refusing to be anything else for long enough. The press, for most of her career, cooperated with the version she offered. This was not entirely unusual for the era. Journalism of the 1950s and 1960s had a different relationship with the personal histories of public figures than contemporary journalism does. The expectation of scrutiny was lower, the tools for investigation were more limited, and the social compact between a subject and the press that covered her was considerably more forgiving of invented or embellished personal narratives, provided the subject was charming enough to make the coverage worthwhile regardless. Estée was charming enough. She was also generous with access, with demonstrations, with the kind of personal attention to journalists that made them feel they had received something real from the interaction. It is difficult to be professionally suspicious of someone who has just made your skin look noticeably better. The arrangement worked until 1985 when it stopped working, in the specific and uncomfortable way that arrangements based on managed information stop working, all at once, from the outside, without warning. A writer named Lee Israel, who had made a reputation producing unauthorized biographies of public figures that were notably less flattering than the subjects would have preferred, published a biography of Estée Lauder that did not cooperate with the official narrative. Israel had done her research. She had found the records, tracked down the sources, established the actual contours of the origin story that Estée had spent 4 decades constructing an alternative to. The book described a woman born in Queens to Hungarian Jewish immigrant parents, who had learned her foundational product knowledge from a chemist uncle, whose contribution had been comprehensively erased from the public record, who had adjusted her birth year across multiple official documents, and whose European aristocratic suggestions were, to use the most neutral available word, unsubstantiated. Israel's book was not a piece of tabloid sensationalism. It was a properly researched biography written by a journalist with the specific skill set for this kind of work. The patience to follow a paper trail, the willingness to talk to people who had no incentive to protect the subject's preferred narrative, and the professional commitment to reporting what she found rather than what would have been most convenient. The portrait that emerged from this process was a more complicated one than Estée had permitted the press to print for 4 decades. A woman of extraordinary drive and genuine talent who had constructed, around those genuine qualities, a personal mythology that was considerably more flattering to her origin than the reality warranted. The talent was real. The mythology was not. The book caused discomfort in the Lauder organization in ways that the public record does not extensively document, but which are not difficult to imagine. A company that had been built partly on the persona of its founder was now facing a published, researched account that called significant elements of that persona into question. The options for responding were limited. Direct contradiction of a documented biography invites the kind of follow-up scrutiny that tends to uncover exactly the things you're trying to contradict. Ignoring it allows the alternative narrative to exist in the market without counter-programming. The remaining option, and the one Estée chose, was to do what she had always done, take control of the story herself. The book did not destroy Estée Lauder the company. The company was, by 1985, far too large and too structurally solid to be undone by a biography, even an accurate one. Youth Jew was 3 decades old and still selling. The brand had expanded into multiple product lines and international markets. The revenue was substantial. A biographical revelation, however unflattering, was not going to empty the Saks counter. But it did create a problem of a different kind. It put someone else in control of the narrative about who Estée Lauder was and where she'd come from, and Estée, who had never been comfortable with other people controlling narratives about anything that affected her, was not going to allow that to stand. Her response was swift and, given everything she had built, entirely predictable. She published her own autobiography, titled simply Estée, A Success Story, which came out the same year as Israel's biography and was not, in its handling of the less flattering elements of the story, quite as candid as Israel's version had been. This was not a surprising choice. The autobiography was not written to be confessional. It was written to be definitive, to re-establish who got to tell this story and from what perspective, and to make available, in bookstores and on nightstands, a version of events that competed with the unauthorized one and carried the authority of the first-person voice. A memoir is an argument. Estée's memoir was an argument that she had made on her own terms, in her own words, with the benefit of choosing which details to include and which to treat as not particularly relevant. The autobiography did not resolve the question of what was invented and what was real, because it was not designed to. It was designed to reassert control, to remind the reader that the person who had built all of this was still here, still articulate, still capable of managing the presentation of her own life, and still considerably more interesting than whatever version a journalist with archival access could produce. In this narrower objective, it succeeded. The Estée Lauder story that most people encountered from that point forward was, again, primarily the one she had constructed, supplemented by the additional detail that Israel's research had made impossible to entirely ignore. The reception of both books was itself an interesting data point. Israel's biography sold to readers who were interested in the gap between the public persona and the private reality, which is a reliable market for biography, and was adequately served by what she'd written. Estée's autobiography sold to a different but equally reliable market, People who were already invested in the Estée Lauder brand and wanted more of the origin story they had been given in magazine profiles and counter-interactions over the years. Each book found its audience. Neither destroyed the other's commercial viability. The biographical marketplace, like the beauty marketplace, turned out to have room for competing versions of the same essential story, provided each version was delivered with enough conviction and aimed at the right customer. What the episode revealed was something that the beauty industry had known in practice, but not quite articulated in theory. The personal brand of a founder is inseparable from the corporate brand in ways that become most visible precisely when someone tries to separate them. Estée Lauder, the company had been built on Estée Lauder the persona, on the idea that this woman knew things about beauty that most people did not know, that her background and her education and her sensibility gave her access to an understanding that was genuine and rarefied, and worth paying premium prices to participate in. The suggestion of European origin was not merely a detail of personal history. It was a foundational element of the brand's authority. If the founder was not who she said she was, then the authority that had been constructed on her identity was open to question, and brand authority, once it becomes open to question, is considerably harder to maintain than brand authority that has never been challenged. The fact that the products remained excellent did not entirely dissolve the question. A good cream is a good cream, regardless of who invented it or where they came from. But the prestige beauty market had never been selling creams in the literal sense. It had been selling the experience of having access to something that not everyone could have, and the gatekeeper to that experience was the person whose name was on the packaging. If the gatekeeper turned out to be from Queens rather than from a world of European refinement, the gate was still there, but its mystique was slightly rearranged. What is perhaps most striking about Estée Lauder's identity management, viewed from the current moment, is how much of what she invented has become standard practice. The personal brand of a company founder is now considered a significant asset to be cultivated, managed, and occasionally reinvented when circumstances require it. The idea that a founder's story adds value to a company's brand is not remotely controversial in contemporary business. It is the premise of an entire industry of personal branding consultants and founder-focused marketing strategies. The idea that the story might not be entirely accurate is also, unfortunately, not particularly shocking. The space between authentic personal brand and carefully managed persona is one that founders across many industries navigate with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of frankness about what they are doing. What Estée did was do this before anyone had a name for it, at a time when the tools of verification were limited, in an industry that was itself built on the gap between promise and reality, between what a product claimed to do and what it actually did, between the aspirational image and the practical function. She was selling a version of herself the same way she was selling a cream, with conviction, with expertise, with the personal attention that made the transaction feel like something more than a transaction, and with the absolute refusal to let the gap between what she was offering and what she was capable of delivering become the thing that defined the interaction. The question her story raises, the one that sits underneath all the specific details of the birth year adjustments and the invented aristocracy and the French effect in the manner, is a genuinely difficult one. Where exactly is the line between the self-invention that we celebrate in founders and the systematic misrepresentation that we identify as fraud? The line exists, but it is not always in the place we expect to find it when we start looking. Estée Lauder's version of the question is complicated by the fact that the thing she was inventing herself into, the version of the world where she belonged in rooms that did not originally have her in them, turned out to be accurate in every way that mattered commercially and culturally. She said she was someone whose understanding of beauty deserved a position at the center of a multi-billion-dollar industry. That turned out to be true. She was not wrong about the destination. She was creative about the route she claimed to have taken to get there. The world she came from, the hardware store in Queens, the immigrant household, the kitchen laboratory with the borrowed formulas, these were not the origins of someone who did not belong in those rooms. They were the origins of someone who had no conventional path into those rooms and built her own path with whatever was at hand, including a set of stories about herself that made the building easier. That is not identical to honesty, but it is not entirely divorced from the truth of what she was and what she could do either. The fiction served the reality. The persona made possible the actual achievement. Whether that makes it forgivable depends considerably on what you think fraud is for and what you think self-invention is worth. What is not debatable is the outcome. Josephine Menzer became Estée Lauder, and Estée Lauder became something that Josephine Menzer, as she actually existed in 1908 in Corona, Queens, could not have become by any other route that the world she was born into made available. The invention was the only available technology. The persona was the only machine she had for getting from one place to the other. Whether we find that admirable or troubling is, perhaps, a reflection of where we ourselves happen to be standing when we look at it. What the story also reveals, in its longer view, is something about the specific relationship between beauty and identity that makes this industry a particularly fertile ground for this kind of personal mythology. Beauty is a business built on the promise of transformation. Every product promises to make something better than it currently is. Every brand is an invitation to become, through the disciplined application of the right products in the right sequence, something closer to an ideal version of yourself. The foundational logic of the entire industry is that the gap between who you are and who you could be is closable, and that the tools for closing it are available for purchase at a counter near you. In this environment, a founder who had closed her own gap through the disciplined application of personal reinvention was not behaving inconsistently with the industry she was building. She was embodying its central promise. She was the advertisement. This is either a deeply ironic observation or a genuinely illuminating one, depending on your tolerance for the kind of recursion where the product and the person selling it turn out to be illustrating the same idea. Estée had sold women the possibility of transformation for decades. She had done it using products that were genuinely effective and a personal sales approach that was genuinely attentive and a distribution model that was genuinely sophisticated. She had also done it while being, herself, a case study in exactly the kind of transformation she was selling. The transformation of Josephine Menzer into Estée Lauder, accomplished not with a cream but with years of consistent effort, social intelligence, and the particular kind of discipline that looks, from the outside, like effortless grace and is, from the inside, anything but. The legacy of this particular aspect of her story is visible in the beauty industry today, though it has taken different forms. The expectation of authenticity from founders and brand leaders has increased significantly since the 1950s. Audiences are considerably more interested in the gap between the presented version and the reality, and considerably better equipped to find it. The tools of biographical investigation that were laborious and expensive in Lee Israel's era are, in the current moment, available to anyone with sufficient curiosity and an internet connection. The persona construction that Estée maintained for 4 decades would be considerably harder to maintain today, and would not last 4 decades under modern scrutiny. And yet the underlying dynamic she was navigating has not disappeared. It has simply shifted form. The pressure to be the right kind of person to sell the right kind of product, to embody an identity that the target customer can aspire to, has not diminished. What has changed is which identities are aspirational and which elements of a real biography are considered assets versus liabilities. Josephine Menzer's actual background, the immigrant family, the working-class neighborhood, the self-made trajectory from nothing to everything, is, by the standards of current marketing sensibility, an extraordinary asset rather than a liability. The authentic origin story that she spent decades hiding is exactly the kind of story that contemporary brand building actively seeks. She was solving the wrong version of the problem for the era she happened to be living in, and solving it with a thoroughness that would prove unnecessary by the time the era had passed. This is, in its own way, one of the more melancholy notes in an otherwise triumphant story. The woman who reinvented herself so completely, who managed her identity with such discipline and consistency, who built an empire partly on the authority of a persona that was not entirely real, was hiding exactly the kind of origin that the world she built would eventually celebrate. The hardware store in Queens, the immigrant mother with the cream and the mirror, the borrowed kitchen and the uncle's formulas, these are not the embarrassment she treated them as. They are the story. They were always the story. It just took the world a while to catch up to that understanding, and by the time it did, Estée Lauder had been something else for so long that going back to the beginning felt, probably, like a different kind of loss. What she built survived the revelation of what was invented, which is, in the end, the most honest measure of what was real. The company that came out of the 1985 biographical moment intact was the company built on excellent products, on the gift-with-purchase innovation, on the counter experience, on the distribution model, on the youth-due phenomenon, on decades of customer loyalty built through genuine personal attention. The persona contributed to all of that. It also obscured some of it. What remained when the obscuring layers were peeled back was, it turned out, more than enough to justify everything that came next. The persona question that occupied the previous chapter is worth keeping in mind as we move into the 1960s, because the insight that drove the next major phase of the Lauder operation was, in a sense, an extension of the same underlying logic. Different people need different versions of a thing in order to want it. Estée had understood this about her own identity. She was now going to apply it to the company itself, in a way that no one in the prestige beauty market had attempted at anything like this scale. The idea sounds obvious in retrospect, as most genuinely good ideas do, which is one of the more reliable ways to identify them. The obvious quality they acquire after the fact is a measure of how completely they have reorganized the landscape they were introduced into. The specific problem she was solving in the early 1960s was one that success had created. The Estée Lauder brand had, by this point, a clear and distinct identity. Polished, aspirational, associated with a particular kind of elegant femininity that had been carefully constructed over 15 years of controlled distribution, personal selling, and the persona management described in the previous chapter. That identity was an asset. It was also, as she was beginning to understand, a constraint. An identity that is specific enough to be compelling is specific enough to exclude. The women who responded to the Estée Lauder aesthetic were a reliable and loyal group, but they were not every woman, and there were adjacent markets. Defined by different values and different aspirations and different relationships to the idea of beauty itself, that the Estée Lauder brand could not enter without undermining the identity that made it valuable. There were also, it should be noted, men. Half the population of the planet traditionally underserved by the prestige beauty and fragrance market, and constituting a commercial opportunity that the industry had been remarkably content to leave largely unexplored. This was not because men did not use grooming products, they did, in considerable quantities, but the prestige end of the market had organized itself around the assumption that grooming products for men were either mass-market items purchased at the drugstore, with no particular brand loyalty, or European imports occupying such a rarefied position that their retail availability in American department stores was limited, and their consumer base correspondingly narrow. The gap between the drugstore and the European import was, if you looked at it commercially rather than culturally, a rather large space in which something interesting could live. Aramis arrived in 1964 to occupy that space. It was, in the context of what the department store fragrance market looked like at the time, a fairly audacious proposition. A men's fragrance and grooming line designed for the prestige department store environment, priced and packaged to suggest that a man using these products was making a statement of quality, rather than simply performing a hygiene routine. The name itself was chosen with the same attention to sound and implication that had characterized the naming of Estée Lauder. Aramis has an ancient, slightly exotic quality that implies history without specifying it too precisely. It suggests the kind of thing that serious people have been using for a long time, without committing to any particular place or era where that serious use was occurring. This was, again, efficient naming, maximum suggestion, minimum specificity, no claims that could be directly contradicted. The development of Aramis required the organization to think seriously about what a man actually wanted from a grooming product, which was in itself a more nuanced question than it appeared. The answer was not simply the women's product experience rephrased in a lower register. Men's relationship to grooming products in 1964 was structured around a specific and somewhat anxious set of cultural negotiations. The act of caring about your appearance was already, for many men of that era, positioned as slightly suspect, as something that required the cover of practicality or utility to be acceptable. You did not buy grooming products because you were interested in how you looked. You bought them because they made you smell appropriate for professional contexts and maintained a general standard of presentability that society required. The vanity was incidental, the function was the point. Aramis worked within this logic rather than against it. The fragrance was presented not as something you wore to attract attention, but as a quality choice that happened to produce a particular kind of presence. The grooming products were positioned similarly, not as beauty treatments, but as the tools of a man who took his professional presentation seriously and chose quality in every domain, which was an identity many men were comfortable with, even if they were slightly uncomfortable with the beauty category itself. The brand was giving men a way to buy what was effectively a prestige beauty product through a door labelled professional quality, which was a different door, but one that opened onto the same counter. The products at the counter were the same regardless of which door the customer had used to arrive. The doors were the marketing. The launch strategy drew directly on what the organisation knew from 15 years of building Estée Lauder: personal demonstration, counter presence, and the selection of the right retail environments. Aramis went into the same prestige department stores that stocked Estée Lauder, which meant the distribution infrastructure was immediately available, and the retail relationships that had taken years to build could be applied to the new brand without starting from scratch. This was one of the earliest and most concrete benefits of the shared infrastructure model. The new brand was not a new company, but a new identity operating within an existing operational structure. The cost of launch was significantly lower than it would have been for an independent brand, and the speed of distribution was significantly faster. The decision to launch Aramis as a completely separate brand rather than as a men's extension of the Estée Lauder line was not self-evident, and it deserves attention because it was the decision that established the template for everything that followed. Estée could have simply extended the existing brand into men's products, as many beauty companies did and continue to do, adding a men's version of successful products and calling it a line extension. This was the obvious move, the comfortable move, the move that required no additional organizational complexity or capital investment in a separate brand identity. It was also, as she understood, the wrong move. The reason it was wrong had nothing to do with the products themselves. It had to do with the customer. A man who had strong feelings about not wanting to use women's cosmetics, which in 1964 described most of the men who were going to spend significant money on grooming products, was not going to reach for something that shared a name with his mother's face cream. The association was not helpful. The Estée Lauder brand, with all its carefully constructed femininity and its specific aspirational positioning, was an asset to a particular kind of customer and a liability to an entirely different one. You could not serve both customers with the same door. You needed a different door, and the different door, if it was done correctly, could lead to the same house. The same house was the point. Aramis was developed, produced, and distributed by the same organization that produced and distributed Estée Lauder products. It used the same operational infrastructure, the same manufacturing relationships, the same distribution network through prestige department stores. The production efficiencies of scale that the Estée Lauder operation had developed over 15 years of growing the main brand were immediately available to Aramis. But Aramis had its own name, its own packaging aesthetic, its own marketing voice, its own counter in the department store, and its own identity that was completely disconnected, in the customer's experience, from the women's brand that happened to be produced in the same building by the same family. The connection was invisible to the consumer. The financial benefit was entirely visible on the balance sheet. This is the multi-brand architecture that every major beauty and consumer goods conglomerate in the world now uses as its operating model. L'Oréal owns brands that compete with each other in the same retail environment, priced at different levels and pitched to different sensibilities, none of which announces its L'Oréal parentage on the front of the package. LVMH owns dozens of luxury brands that maintain studiously separate identities while sharing back-end infrastructure and financial management. The model is the standard. But in 1964, when Aramis launched, it was genuinely novel in the specific context of prestige beauty. Nobody had done it quite this way. Estée Lauder was not simply entering the men's market. She was inventing a way of thinking about brand architecture that would take the rest of the industry several decades to fully absorb. Aramis worked, commercially, in the specific and somewhat ironic sense that it worked with men who would not have touched anything called Estée Lauder, but were perfectly happy to use something called Aramis because it sounded ancient and authoritative and was available at the right kind of store at the right kind of price. The fragrance itself was a serious oriental composition, rich and persistent in the way that prestige fragrances for men were expected to be, and it was positioned not as a luxury indulgence, but as the intelligent choice of a man who understood quality. This was, for men who were somewhat suspicious of the entire category of grooming as an aesthetic pursuit, a considerably more comfortable framing. You were not being vain, you were making an informed decision, which is a very different thing, obviously. The success of Aramis established that the model worked. It also established something subtler, that the Lauder organization had the internal capacity to develop and launch an entirely new brand with a distinct identity, which was not a capability that most beauty companies of the era had developed because most beauty companies of the era had not needed it. The infrastructure of brand development, the ability to think through an identity from the ground up, name it, package it, position it, train counter staff to communicate it, and place it in the right retail environment with the right level of support. This was now inside the organization as a practice skill. They had done it once. They could do it again. The question was what the next gap in the market looked like. The answer came partly from an unexpected source, a magazine, Vogue specifically, and a conversation that Estée had with an editor there named Carol Phillips, who would become the founding creative force behind what was about to become Clinique. The conversation, in various accounts, centered on an article Vogue was developing about whether a woman could have great skin through disciplined care rather than genetic luck alone. This was, for 1967, a somewhat provocative premise. The conventional wisdom of the beauty industry was that you sold products by implying that using them would improve your skin while stopping considerably short of claiming that skin health was primarily a function of product use and routine discipline. The industry was not in the business of suggesting that its customers were in control of outcomes. That was not the most comfortable commercial position. It was, however, an interesting one, and Estée found it extremely interesting. Clinique launched in 1968, and almost everything about it was a deliberate inversion of what Estée Lauder the brand communicated. Where Estée Lauder was warm, personal and aspirational in the manner of a sophisticated older woman sharing wisdom, Clinique was cool, clinical, and scientific in the manner of a dermatologist who found your skin professionally interesting and had data to support every recommendation. The name itself made this explicit. Clinique is the French word for clinic, and the entire brand identity was organized around the idea that skincare was a medical discipline rather than a beauty ritual. This was not subtle. The packaging was white and sage green, suggesting a pharmacy or a doctor's office rather than a vanity table. The counter staff wore white lab coats. The language used to describe the products emphasized dermatological testing, allergy testing, and scientific formulation in terms that implied peer-reviewed authority rather than the more atmospheric claims typical of beauty marketing. The three-step system that Clinique introduced, cleanser, exfoliator, moisturizer, in a specific sequence for a specific skin type, was presented not as a beauty routine but as a skin protocol. The framing was important. A beauty routine is something you do because you want to look good. A skin protocol is something you follow because it is correct, because it produces measurable outcomes, and because the alternative is doing it wrong. The shift from aspiration to correctness as the primary motivation was, for a segment of the market that was becoming increasingly skeptical of unsubstantiated beauty claims, extremely compelling. Clinique was selling not beauty but expertise, and expertise was a product that the growing market of educated, professionally active women in the late 1960s and early 1970s was considerably more responsive to than the traditional beauty aspiration of the previous generation. It is worth understanding why the late 1960s was the particular moment for this kind of brand, because timing matters in brand development, and Clinique's timing was unusually precise. The cultural landscape of 1968 was not the landscape of 1958. The intervening decade had produced a significant and largely one-directional shift in how educated American women related to authority, to institutions, and to the gap between what they were told and what was actually true. The generation of women entering the consumer market in the late 1960s had grown up watching that gap become visible in increasingly uncomfortable ways, and they were not, as a result, particularly receptive to marketing that simply told them something was good without explaining why. They wanted reasons, they wanted data, they wanted the kind of authority that could be examined rather than simply accepted. Clinique's dermatologist positioning was not simply a clever marketing angle. It was an accurate reading of what a specific and growing consumer segment was prepared to trust. The decision to make Clinique entirely fragrance-free was also more consequential than it might appear. Fragrance in cosmetics in 1968 was essentially universal. Almost every beauty product was scented, partly because fragrance was associated with luxury, and partly because it masked the chemical smell of some of the less pleasant ingredients that were in common use. The fragrance-free formulation was therefore both a safety choice and a market differentiation choice, but it was also, in ways that took some time to become fully visible, a competitive moat. Clinique was building a customer base of women with sensitive skin or fragrance allergies, women who could not use most of what the department store beauty floor offered, and who were therefore extraordinarily loyal to the brand that had made itself safe for them. Brand loyalty built on need rather than preference is, in most circumstances, more durable than brand loyalty built on preference alone. Clinique was accumulating a very large number of customers who did not have the option to switch. The hypoallergenic positioning was similarly precise. Allergic reactions to cosmetics were a genuine consumer concern that the industry had, unsurprisingly, addressed primarily by not talking about it. Clinique addressed it directly. Every product was formulated without fragrance, and with ingredients chosen specifically to minimize the risk of allergic reaction. Every product was tested by dermatologists, a claim that was made prominently and specifically rather than vaguely implied. The fragrance-free formulation was not merely a safety choice, but a positioning choice. It differentiated Clinique from everything around it on the department store floor, which was drowning in fragrance, and it communicated a seriousness about skin health that functioned as its own form of authority. What Clinique was also doing, and this was perhaps the most strategically interesting aspect of the launch, was addressing a customer who did not particularly think of herself as a beauty consumer. The woman who was most responsive to Clinique's positioning was not the woman who read beauty magazines and followed fashion, and was already engaged with the aspirational world that the Estée Lauder brand addressed. She was the woman who had a practical, results-oriented relationship with her appearance, who wanted good skin rather than glamour, who was more likely to trust a dermatologist than a makeup artist, and who had been somewhat alienated by the theatrical quality of conventional beauty marketing. She was, in the vocabulary of the era, a sensible woman, and she had been largely underserved by the prestige beauty market, which had not been particularly interested in sensible. Clinique was very interested in sensible. It was in fact built for sensible, and the sensible customer turned out to be an enormous market. The brand grew rapidly through the early 1970s, attracting precisely the customers it was designed to attract, and building the kind of loyalty that a product generates when it actually does what it claims to do. The three-step system worked. The hypoallergenic formulations were genuinely gentler than what most women were using. The dermatologist involvement was real. Clinique was not merely a different aesthetic applied to the same product quality. It was a different product philosophy expressed through a different brand identity, and both the philosophy and the identity were genuinely distinct from anything else in the market. The organizational logic of running two such distinct brands simultaneously was not straightforward, and the Lauder operation had to develop internal structures to manage the separation. The separation had to be real enough that it held up in the customer's experience. If a woman at the Clinique counter recognized that the person managing the Estée Lauder counter across the aisle was from the same company, applying the same training, following the same operational protocols, the clinical authority of Clinique was somewhat compromised. The lab coat was doing a lot of work, but the lab coat could only do so much if the rest of the store experience did not support the illusion of genuine separation. Managing this required internal discipline about how the two operations were presented, staffed, and managed in public, even while they shared infrastructure in private. The financial architecture that made this work, shared manufacturing, shared distribution logistics, shared research and development investment, while maintaining separate brand presentations, was the core innovation of the multi-brand model. The scale advantages of a larger operation were captured without being visible to the consumer, who experienced each brand as though it existed independently. This created a genuine competitive advantage that went beyond brand identity. The Lauder organization could develop and launch new brands faster and more cheaply than a comparable standalone operation because the foundational infrastructure already existed. Each new brand did not require building a production facility or a distribution network from scratch. It required building a brand identity, which was the part the organization had become unusually good at. Prescriptives, which launched in 1979, pushed the personalization concept further than anything that had come before. Where Clinique had personalized the recommendation through skin type assessment, Prescriptives personalized the product itself, offering custom-blended foundation shades matched to an individual customer's specific skin tone, rather than asking the customer to find her approximate match among a limited range of preset options. This was, in 1979, a genuinely novel idea in the department store context. The concept of mass customization, the ability to produce individually tailored products at scale, was not yet a familiar feature of retail. Prescriptives was attempting it in real time, at the counter, using colour-matching technology that was, by the standards of the era, fairly sophisticated. The customer proposition was clear and compelling. Instead of settling for the foundation shade that was closest to your actual skin tone, you could have the one that was actually your skin tone. This was not merely a convenience. It was a statement about the customer's worth, about the fact that her specific appearance was particular enough to deserve a product made for it, rather than a product that had been made for a generalized version of her. In the vocabulary of the time, this felt luxurious because it was. The experience of having something made specifically for you, rather than choosing from available options, is one that humans reliably value above almost any other form of retail attention. Prescriptives was selling that experience in the beauty category, which was a category where the individual variation was large enough that the personalization proposition was genuinely meaningful. Origins, which arrived in 1990, addressed an entirely different cultural moment. By the late 1980s, environmental consciousness had shifted from a fringe position to a mainstream concern. And the beauty industry was beginning to face questions about its environmental impact that it had not previously been asked in any organized way. The ingredients in cosmetics, the packaging waste generated by the industry, the testing methods used to validate safety, the sourcing of raw materials, these were becoming subjects of consumer interest rather than simply regulatory compliance. The customers who cared most intensely about these things were not currently the loyal customers of the prestige beauty brands, which had not been particularly eager to engage with the environmental critique. They were, in many cases, actively avoiding conventional prestige beauty in favour of smaller, independent brands that positioned themselves as natural, ethical, and ecologically responsible. Origins was designed to bring those customers into the department store. It positioned itself as a natural beauty brand rooted in plant-based ingredients, honest formulations, and environmental responsibility, with packaging designed to minimize waste and messaging that acknowledged the environmental stakes of the beauty industry in a way that no other prestige brand was doing at the time. The brand was housed in the same department stores as Estée Lauder and Clinique, which was itself a statement. It was suggesting that the natural, ethical beauty consumer did not have to choose between her values and the quality and accessibility of the prestige department store. She could have both, and Origins was the door through which she could have them. Each of these brands, Aramis, Clinique, Prescriptives, Origins, was addressing a different customer who was, for different reasons, not currently being served by the existing Estée Lauder brand. Each was using a different identity to reach that customer: masculine authority, clinical precision, individual customization, environmental integrity. None of them announced their connection to the family business that produced them. The Lauder name did not appear on the Clinique counter or the Origins packaging. The organizational parentage was known in the industry and available to anyone who looked it up. But it was not part of the consumer experience of any individual brand. Each brand presented itself as what it was, which was something genuinely distinct from the others, even if the distinction was maintained by a family organization that was making money on all of them. The elegance of this architecture is something worth pausing on, because it represents a genuine intellectual achievement in addition to a commercial one. The conventional wisdom of branding in the mid-20th century held that a brand needed to mean something consistent and specific. That breadth of offering undermined the specificity that gave a brand value, and that trying to be multiple things to multiple people was a reliable path to being nothing in particular to anyone. This wisdom was not wrong exactly. A single brand that tried to simultaneously be clinical and aspirational, masculine and feminine, natural and sophisticated, would indeed end up meaning nothing. The Lauder insight was that you did not have to make a single brand do all those things. You could build several brands, each of which meant something specific and consistent to its specific audience, and let the financial benefits accrue to the organization behind all of them, without requiring any of the brands to carry the organizational identity on their labels. This is also, when you step back and look at it from the right distance, a very sophisticated application of the same logic that drove the distribution model. Just as limiting where the products could be purchased had created value by association, limiting what each brand communicated had created value by specificity. The exclusivity in this case was not geographic or economic, but psychographic. Each brand excluded certain customers by design, not because it did not want their money, but because the customers it was designed to attract would be less attracted if the brand was also designed to attract everyone else. The deliberate narrowness of each brand's identity was what made that identity worth having, and the portfolio of narrow identities together covered a very broad range of customers indeed. The organizational challenge of managing multiple brands with genuine distinctness was not trivial and should not be understated. The temptation to let the brands blur at the edges, to share marketing messages or visual elements or retail experiences that made them seem more similar than different, was real and had to be actively resisted. Brand managers at each label had to maintain the integrity of their specific brand identity, even when efficiency arguments could be made for some degree of convergence. The discipline required was similar to the discipline required to maintain the Estée Lauder persona across decades: consistency, attention to detail, and the willingness to invest in maintaining a separation that was strategically essential even when the immediate pressure was toward convenience. The model that the Lauder organization developed and refined through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s became, through a gradual process of competitive imitation, that is the sincerest form of industry acknowledgement, the standard architecture of the prestige beauty market. L'Oréal had already been building a multi-brand portfolio through acquisition, but the Lauder approach of developing brands organically from the inside, purpose-built for specific market gaps, was a different and in some respects more elegant version of the same idea. When the conglomerates of the 1980s and 90s began assembling beauty portfolios at scale, they were largely rationalizing an approach that the Lauder operation had pioneered at a family company level 2 decades earlier. The specific insight that the most valuable thing you can do with a strong brand is not stretch it, but build alongside it, that customer loyalty is segment-specific, and that the same family can own multiple loyalties without any segment knowing they belong to the same family, is one that continues to shape how the industry is organized. Walk through the beauty floor of any major department store today and count the brands that share operational parentage without sharing brand identity. The number will be considerably higher than most shoppers realize, and the architecture behind it traces back to a family in New York that figured out in the 1960s that one door was never going to be enough. What Estée had done, in other words, was extend the personalization instinct that had defined her selling method from the beginning into the structure of the organization itself. She had always believed that different customers needed different experiences. She had always adapted her approach to the person in front of her. The multi-brand strategy was that same instinct operated at organizational scale. Different customers needed different brands, and the right response to that reality was not to compromise any single brand, but to build as many brands as there were distinct customer realities worth serving. It is also worth noting that this portfolio approach had a resilience that the single brand model lacked. When one brand encountered a challenging year, whether from competitive pressure, a product recall, or simply a shift in consumer taste, the other brands in the portfolio continued generating revenue and maintaining organizational momentum. The Lauder organization was not betting on a single product or a single customer relationship to carry the entire business. It was distributing its risks across multiple distinct bets, each of which was independently viable and capable of growing or contracting without bringing the whole structure down. This was, from a pure business management perspective, an extremely sensible way to run a company that intended to last. It was also, from a founder's perspective, a way of building something that was larger than any single vision could sustain, by multiplying the visions rather than stretching one beyond its natural limits. The Queen of Queens, as nobody in particular called her, had figured out that the kingdom was bigger than anyone had realized, and that ruling it did not require fitting everyone through the same door. The multi-brand architecture that had been built through the 1960s gave the Lauder organization something it had not previously possessed in sufficient quantity: optionality. The company now had multiple revenue streams, multiple customer relationships, and multiple brand identities that could be deployed in different configurations in different markets. This last quality, the deployability of distinct brand identities, was about to become extremely useful, because the next phase of expansion was going to require a degree of market-by-market adaptability that a single brand organization would have struggled to provide. The world outside the United States was not a single place. It was several dozen distinct commercial and cultural environments, each with its own relationship to beauty, to prestige, to the specific signals that a brand communicated through its name and its packaging and the kind of store it chose to occupy. Navigating all of that with a single identity would have been like trying to have one conversation with 30 different people simultaneously. Theoretically possible, practically limiting. The decision to enter the European market in the early 1960s was, at the time, not the obvious move it would become in retrospect. American beauty companies of that era were not, as a rule, particularly interested in European expansion. The American market was large, growing, and familiar, which made it comfortable. Europe was a different set of retail structures, different regulatory environments, different consumer expectations, and, for the specific category of prestige beauty, a landscape already populated by native producers who had been doing this for considerably longer, and who had, in their home markets, the significant advantage of being considered European rather than merely claiming to sound it. The French beauty industry, in particular, was not going to greet an American competitor with unambiguous enthusiasm. Chanel, Lancôme, Guerlain. These were not brands that were sitting in their Paris offices worried about an American family company from Queens. They were, at that point, not even particularly sure what the threat would look like if it arrived. It arrived at Harrods first, which was the correct choice on several levels simultaneously. Harrods in London was not simply a store. It was, in the mid-20th century, a British institution of sufficient cultural weight that its endorsement of a product carried a meaning that extended beyond the transaction itself. To be at Harrods was to be, in the specific register that Harrods communicated, legitimate, the same logic that had driven the decision to pursue Saks Fifth Avenue, rather than accept any retail location that would have them now applied internationally. The first location in a new market needed to be the right location, because that location would define where the brand belonged in the customer's mental map of available choices. Choosing Harrods communicated, without requiring any explanatory advertising, that this was a brand that belonged in the company of other things that Harrods stocked. That was a very large and very efficient piece of positioning. The counter opening at Harrods was not managed remotely. Estée went to London. She opened the counter the way she had been opening counters in the United States for 15 years, personally, with demonstrations, with the specific quality of attention to each individual customer that had been the foundational selling method from the very beginning. The British market in the early 1960s was not, as a whole, an environment that particularly expected this kind of intensity from a cosmetics counter. British retail culture of the era had a somewhat different relationship to the hard sell. There was a general expectation of restraint, of waiting for the customer to indicate interest rather than moving to intercept it. Estée's counter approach was the opposite of restrained. It was warm and direct and confident in a way that some British customers found slightly overwhelming, and others found absolutely compelling, which is more or less the same spectrum of responses she had generated in American salons 20 years earlier. The ones who found it compelling came back. The ones who found it overwhelming told their friends about the American woman who had enthusiastically applied cream to their faces without being asked, and their friends came to have a look, and some of those friends also came back. The counter performed well. The success at Harrods opened the conversation with other British retailers, and the British market was established with a speed that suggested the demand had been there before the supply arrived, which is the most flattering possible indicator for a new market entry. From London, the expansion moved toward Paris, which was a considerably more complicated undertaking for reasons that were as cultural as they were commercial. Paris was, and to a considerable extent remains, the capital of the global beauty industry. The major French houses occupied that position not merely through marketing, but through genuine historical depth. The French beauty and fragrance industry had been producing sophisticated products for centuries, and the cultural assumption that French meant superior in the beauty category was not simply a prejudice without foundation. It had foundation. The products from the French houses were genuinely excellent. The training of their counter staff was rigorous, and the retail environment they occupied in the Galeries Lafayette and other Parisian grands magasins was both prestigious and deeply familiar to the French consumer who had been shopping there for generations. Entering this market as an American brand with no French heritage was, in the most literal sense, a bold move. It was the kind of bold move that gets retrospectively described as visionary when it works and as hubristic when it does not. And whether you describe it as visionary depends almost entirely on whether you're reading about it before or after the result was known. What made it less suicidal than it might appear was the brand's name. Estée, with its accent, its French phonetics, its continental sound quality, landed in a French ear differently than a name like, for example, Elizabeth or Helena. The brand did not sound American to a French consumer encountering it without prior knowledge of its origin. It sounded, depending on how much attention you paid to it, vaguely French, or at least plausibly continental, which was considerably better than sounding like it had been shipped from New Jersey. The years of investment in the name's phonetic quality, the decision to add the accent, to soften the presentation, to allow the brand to suggest European sophistication, rather than announcing American origin, paid off in a market where American origin was not necessarily an advantage, and where the brand could, in the absence of explicit information to the contrary, be received as something more local than it was. This was either an extremely clever piece of long-term planning or a happy accident that several decades of consistent brand management had converted into a strategic asset. Probably both, in the proportion that most genuinely useful decisions involve. The French market also required a specific kind of humility that did not come naturally to an organization that had spent 15 years being right about what American women wanted. French consumers in the 1960s were not particularly interested in being told what they needed by an American company, even an American company that spoke their language in the phonetic sense. The adaptation required was not about product formulation, which had already been refined to a quality standard that could hold its own in any market. It was about register. The way the brand communicated in French needed to respect the French customer's assumption that she knew things about beauty that were not being taught to her from across the Atlantic. The language of the counter, the tone of the marketing materials, the way the counter staff was trained to approach a customer who had walked in already knowing a great deal about skincare and was not looking for elementary instruction, all of this needed adjustment that went beyond translation. Estée herself managed this with the adaptability that had characterized her approach from the beginning. She observed. She watched how French women interacted with beauty counters and what they responded to and what they did not. She adjusted the approach without adjusting the underlying principles, which was the same thing she'd been doing since she first noticed that a Miami socialite and a Queens neighbor required different versions of the same essential interaction. The underlying principle was always the same. Meet the customer where she is, understand what she actually wants, give her an experience that is worth having for its own sake. What changed between markets was the inflection, the specific social grammar of the encounter. The product and the method were constant. The delivery was flexible. Galeries Lafayette was the strategic retail choice in Paris for the same reasons Harrods had been the choice in London. It was the address that communicated the right things about where this brand belonged in the French retail hierarchy. The approach to the buyer, the demonstration of the product, the insistence on a counter that delivered the personal experience rather than simply displaying product for self-service selection. All of this was the same method that had worked in New York and London, translated into a French retail context that was not identical, but was analogous in the ways that mattered. French women who cared about the quality of their skincare were not, it turned out, fundamentally different from American or British women who cared about the quality of their skincare. They wanted something that worked. They wanted to feel that someone with genuine knowledge was making a recommendation specifically for them rather than at them. They wanted the experience to be worth having for its own sake. All of this was available at the Estée Lauder counter in Galeries Lafayette. The French text, the packaging, the product names were adapted. The underlying method was not. The expansion through Europe continued through the 1960s and into the 1970s, with a geographic logic that prioritized the markets where the retail infrastructure of prestige department stores already existed and where the consumer appetite for this category of product was established. Germany, Italy, Switzerland, the Scandinavian countries, each market added to the distribution network with a speed that reflected both the organization's operational capacity and the demand that was meeting the product at each new location. The specific retail partners varied by market, but the principle remained consistent. The first point of entry needed to be the best available address in that market, and everything that happened at that address needed to replicate the experience that had been building loyalty in the American market for 2 decades. By the middle of the 1970s, the products were available in more than 70 countries, which is a number that sounds impressive in isolation, and becomes more impressive when you consider that it had been achieved without a significant external capital raise, without acquiring other companies, and without the kind of organizational infrastructure that most businesses would consider the minimum requirement for operating at that geographic scale. The expansion had been funded primarily through the revenue generated by an operation that was growing at each level simultaneously. More brands, more countries, more counters, more loyalty from an expanding customer base. The youth-due revenue that had created the financial foundation in the 1950s had been deployed to build the brand architecture of the 1960s, and that architecture was now generating the revenue to fund the international expansion of the 1970s. The financial story of the Lauder operation is, in this respect, a remarkably clean compounding story. Each stage of growth created the resources for the next stage without requiring the kind of external financing that brings external control and dilutes the family's ability to make decisions on a timeline that suits the business rather than a quarterly earnings calendar. The moment that carried the most personal weight in the entire international expansion was, in a sense, the one that was most removed from commercial logic. The opening of the first Estée Lauder point of presence in Budapest in the late 1980s was not a strategically critical market entry in the way that London or Paris had been. Hungary in the late 1980s was still emerging from the particular economic experience of 4 decades of Soviet bloc management, which had produced, among other things, a consumer goods market that was not exactly overflowing with prestige beauty options. The commercial opportunity was real, but not urgent in the way that Western European markets had been. What made Budapest significant was not the revenue projection, it was the return. Estée's family had come from Hungary, from the specific kind of Hungarian Jewish immigrant community that had left, or been pushed, toward America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The grandparents who had made that journey, who had arrived in Queens with the hardware store and the crowded apartment, and the specific circumstances that had produced Josephine Menzer, had come from the country that was now, after decades and a complete transformation of the geopolitical map, about to stock Estée Lauder products. The family's prosperity, built in America over 4 decades from nothing, was returning to the place where the family had started from something. This was, depending on your relationship to the idea of historical symmetry, either enormously meaningful or simply a coincidence that happened to have emotional resonance. The Lauder family appeared to find it meaningful. The commercial operation in Budapest grew from there, and grew well, which is what tends to happen when you enter a market that has been waiting a long time for what you are offering. The 150-country figure that the company eventually reached was not achieved quickly or uniformly. Different markets required different timelines and different approaches. Some markets were entered early and grew steadily. Others required patience before the retail infrastructure and consumer income levels combined to make the prestige beauty category commercially viable. The expansion into Asia, for example, which would eventually become one of the company's most important growth engines, took time to develop in the specific way that markets where the relevant consumer class is emerging rather than established take time. You are building the market at the same time you are entering it, which is a different proposition than arriving somewhere that already knows what it wants. The thread connecting all of this geographic diversity was the same thread that had connected everything from the very beginning. The counter experience, the personal demonstration, the insistence that the customer's interaction with the brand should feel like an encounter with genuine expertise rather than a retail transaction. Different languages, different retail formats, different cultural expectations about the appropriate social distance between a salesperson and a customer, all of these varied by market. But the fundamental proposition did not vary. This product works, the person at this counter can show you how and why, and the experience of finding out is worth having. That proposition had worked in a Queen's salon in the early 1940s. It worked at Harrods in the early 1960s. It worked in Galeries Lafayette in the mid-1960s. It worked, with appropriate adaptation for local context, in every market where it was applied. The universality of the underlying appeal was, in retrospect, not surprising given that the appeal was fundamentally human. The desire to be attended to with genuine expertise and genuine interest is not particularly culture-specific. It is just human. The dynasty question, which is what the international expansion was building toward without quite announcing that it was doing so, had been present in the Lauder operation from the beginning. Estée had always understood that what she was building was not simply a business that would generate income for a finite period and then be sold. It was a structure that was supposed to outlast her, that was supposed to carry the family name and the family values and the family's specific approach to the world into a future that she intended to control even from a distance. This is not an unusual ambition for a founder, but it requires specific decisions, made early and maintained consistently, about how the organization is governed and who gets to make the decisions that determine its direction. The most important of those decisions, made early and never seriously revisited, was that the family was going to remain in control. Not as consultants or as honorary board members or as faces on the marketing materials, but in the actual day-to-day governance of the company, in the positions that determined strategy and personnel and capital allocation. The heir apparent was Leonard, who had been part of the operation for most of his adult life, and who had developed, through proximity and inheritance and his own considerable intelligence, a version of his mother's instincts translated into the vocabulary of a more formally educated generation. He understood the brand the way someone understands something they have grown up with, not as an external concept to be analysed, but as a native language. He also understood the business side with a sophistication that came from having watched it built from the inside and having participated in its construction at every stage. Leonard's contribution to the company is sometimes framed primarily in terms of continuation, as though his role were primarily to maintain what Estée had created rather than to actively expand and develop it. This framing significantly undersells what he actually did. The brand architecture that produced Aramis and Clinique and the subsequent sub-brands was developed under his significant influence. The international expansion that took the company from a primarily American operation to one present in dozens of countries was managed, in its operational detail, under his leadership. The decision to take the company public in 1995, with the specific dual-class share structure that preserved family control, was a piece of financial engineering that reflected his understanding of how to give the company the resources it needed without giving away the governance it required. None of these were the actions of someone simply holding a position that had been handed to him. They were the actions of someone who had absorbed the foundational principles of the business deeply enough to apply them to situations that had not existed when those principles were first established. He also had his mother's instinct for talent, which is perhaps the most important quality a leader of a brand-dependent business can have. The people who designed the Clinique counter experience, who developed the Origins brand positioning, who led the international expansion market by market, were not primarily family members. They were professionals whom Leonard attracted and retained by building an organization that was genuinely interesting to work for, that gave creative and strategic people the ability to do consequential work without the bureaucratic friction that larger and more conventionally organized companies often impose. The family control of the governance did not translate into family monopoly over the interesting jobs. It translated into a stability of vision that allowed good people to do their best work without worrying that the strategy would change dramatically under them every time the market had a bad quarter. Leonard became the public face of the company's growth through the 1970s and 1980s, as Estée gradually reduced her day-to-day operational involvement without reducing her presence as a symbol of what the brand was. He was, by temperament and training, a different kind of leader than his mother had been. More corporate in his methods, more interested in organizational structure, more comfortable with the formalized systems that a company of the Lauder operations scale required. He was also, in ways that he would have been the first to acknowledge, working within a brand identity that his mother had created, and that remained, even as he led the company forward, fundamentally hers. He was not inventing the Estée Lauder brand. He was stewarding it, extending it, applying it to new markets and new product opportunities in ways that were consistent with what it had always been. This is a less dramatic role than founding, but it is not an easier one, and Leonard performed it with a competence that the company's sustained growth through his tenure suggests was genuine rather than merely inherited. Ronald Lauder took a different path, which is either a testament to the family's breadth of ambition or a reminder that not every child of a successful founder finds business the most interesting available arena. Ronald went into politics and diplomacy and philanthropy, which are all fields that benefit from the kind of resources that come from having grown up in a family that was accumulating considerable wealth throughout your childhood and young adulthood. He served in the Defense Department during the Reagan administration as a Deputy Assistant Secretary, which is a role that sounds extremely important, and is, by the standards of government bureaucracy, fairly senior. He then became the United States Ambassador to Austria in the mid-1980s, which was a posting that carried, for a man with Hungarian family roots, a particular resonance given Austria's geographic and historical relationship to the region his grandparents had come from. The Austrian ambassadorship was not simply a ceremonial appointment. Ronald used the position to engage seriously with the documentation and acknowledgement of the region's wartime history, which was not, in the mid-1980s, a subject that the Austrian government was eager to discuss at length. The political and diplomatic work he did in this period was meaningful in ways that extended well beyond his official role, and it established him as someone whose interests in the history and future of Central and Eastern European Jewish communities were serious rather than peripheral. He went on to lead the World Jewish Congress, a position of genuine influence in the global Jewish institutional landscape, and he has been a significant presence in issues of cultural heritage, restitution of art and property, and the relationship between Jewish communities and the governments of countries where that history is complicated. This is a career that would be notable regardless of the family name attached to it. But the family name and the family resources were clearly not incidental to how the career was possible and what it could accomplish. The interplay between the commercial dynasty Estée had built and the political and philanthropic roles her children and grandchildren took on was not accidental. It reflected a specific kind of ambition that Estée had always had, not merely to be wealthy, but to have a family that mattered, that was consequential in the world in multiple registers simultaneously. Business success was the foundation. The other registers, political influence, cultural leadership, philanthropic reach, were the architecture built on top of it. The grandchildren presented the next challenge in dynasty management, which is the challenge that comes after the founder's generation and the first successor generation have established themselves. How do you maintain family control over an enterprise that has grown large enough that family members cannot possibly fill all the positions that require competent leadership, while still ensuring that the family's values and priorities actually drive the organization, rather than being gradually diluted by the professional managers who are increasingly running the day-to-day reality of a global business? This is one of the fundamental problems of family business governance, and it is one that has ended the family control of more dynasties than can easily be counted. The Lauders' approach to this problem was structural rather than purely personal. The family maintained control not through the force of individual personality, though individual personality remained relevant, but through the ownership structure of the company, which was organized to preserve family voting power even as the operational complexity of the organization grew. When the company eventually went public in 1995, which was a decision that reflected both the desire to provide liquidity for various family interests and the recognition that the capital markets could provide resources for growth that the company's internal cash generation alone could not easily match, the family made sure that the structure of the public offering preserved their ability to make the decisions that mattered. The 1995 IPO was handled with the same strategic precision that had characterized the company's major decisions from the beginning. Two classes of shares were created, one class that was offered to the public and carried standard voting rights, and another class that the family retained and that carried significantly enhanced voting power. This dual-class structure meant that the family could raise substantial capital from public investors, while retaining the ability to determine the company's strategic direction, without being subject to the pressures that public shareholders typically apply to management. This was not, by 1995, an unusual structure for a family company going public. Various technology and media companies had used similar approaches, but it was, for the beauty industry, fairly distinctive, and it was done in a way that was transparent and legally straightforward while being commercially very well designed. The result was a company that was publicly traded, with the liquidity and the capital access that public status provided, while remaining, in every decision that actually mattered, a family company. The quarterly earnings pressures that shape the behavior of truly public companies, the activist shareholders who acquire stakes and demand strategic changes, the proxy battles that sometimes redirect the leadership of public enterprises, none of these had the leverage over the Lauder organization that they would have had over a more conventionally structured public company. The family could, and did, take a long view of the business in a way that truly public companies often find structurally difficult. Whether this was entirely good for the company is a question that does not have a simple answer. The long view is valuable when the long view is correct. Family control is a strength when the family members in control are genuinely the best available people for the roles they occupy. It is a source of risk when the logic of family succession places people in positions for which they are not ideally suited, or when the insularity that family control can produce makes the organization slower to recognize and respond to challenges that an outside perspective would have identified earlier. The Lauder organization has had moments of both. The family's commitment to quality and to the specific brand values that Estée established has been a genuine and sustained asset. The insularity has occasionally shown up in strategic decisions that were slower than they needed to be, and in an organizational culture that was, at times, more comfortable with familiarity than with the disruption that any large organization periodically requires. The question of nepotism, which is the word people use when they want to raise the concern about family succession, without necessarily being specific about which decisions were wrong, is one that follows every significant family enterprise through its lifetime. The Lauders are not exempt from the question. What they have, as a defense against its most damaging implications, is the track record of the decisions that the family governance model produced. A company that grew from a kitchen laboratory to a global operation with over 25 brands and distribution in more than 150 countries, maintained over 7 decades, with the brand values that Estée established remaining recognizable and meaningful throughout. That is not the track record of an organization whose family governance was primarily a liability. It is the track record of an organization that made a specific bet about how to govern itself and won the bet, at least through the period during which the bet can be evaluated. Whether the bet continues to win in the decades to come is a question that the future will answer. What the past suggests is that the specific quality Estée brought to every dimension of the business she built, the refusal to accept the available options when a better option was theoretically possible if you were willing to work for it, did not disappear when she handed the operational reins to Leonard. It was encoded in the structure of the organization, in the brand identity, in the retail model, in the multi-brand architecture, in the distribution philosophy, in the counter experience, and in the family governance structure that she had been building as carefully as any other part of the business since the beginning. She was building a dynasty. It turned out she had built one. The dynasty that had been carefully assembled across 7 decades. The brands, the international reach, the family governance structure, the carefully managed narrative of origins and identity, all of it had been built on a foundation of genuine quality and genuine commercial innovation. That is worth saying clearly before the complications arrive, because the complications are real and deserve to be examined without the examination becoming an excuse to dismiss everything that was genuinely impressive about the construction. What follows is not a verdict. It is a set of questions that a business at this scale inevitably generates, and which a serious look at the story requires taking seriously. The first and most structurally complex of these questions involves an ingredient that became obligatory for a specific market: animal testing. The beauty industry's relationship to animal testing is a subject that has evolved considerably over the decades, and the Estée Lauder company's position within that evolution is more complicated than either its critics or its corporate communications would generally suggest. The company made public commitments over the years to reducing and eventually eliminating animal testing as a standard practice in its product development. Several of the brands in its portfolio, including some that were acquired rather than developed internally, had built their entire market positioning around the promise of being cruelty-free. This was not a minor footnote in those brands' identities. It was central to what they were and why certain customers chose them over alternatives. The complication arrived, as complications often do, from a geography. China, which by the 2000s and 2010s had become one of the world's most significant beauty markets and was growing faster than almost any other, had regulations that required imported cosmetic products to be tested on animals before they could be sold in the country. This was not a company policy decision. It was a legal requirement of a market that the company very much wanted to be in. The revenue opportunity in China was enormous. The animal testing requirement was non-negotiable under the regulations as they existed, and several of the brands in the portfolio that had been positioning themselves as cruelty-free were now part of a company that was selling in a market that required the testing those brands had built their identity around opposing. The specific tension with acquired brands made this problem considerably sharper than it would have been with internally developed brands. MAC Cosmetics, acquired by the Estée Lauder companies in the late 1990s, had built a significant part of its identity around inclusivity, and a kind of progressive values alignment that made it culturally distinct from the more traditional Estée Lauder positioning. Aveda, known for its environmental commitments and natural ingredient philosophy, presented an even starker case. Both brands attracted consumers who were making purchasing decisions partly based on values alignment, and both found themselves under the umbrella of a parent company navigating the China testing requirement. The counter-argument, that the brands maintained their own development practices and that the regulatory testing was performed externally by Chinese authorities rather than by the brands themselves, was technically accurate and ethically insufficient for the segment of the consumer base that found the distinction unconvincing. The company is not unique in this situation. Virtually every major beauty company with Chinese market ambitions has navigated versions of the same tension, and the responses have ranged from full withdrawal from the Chinese market to partial market entry, with specific product categories that were exempt from testing requirements, to the full market engagement with the regulatory testing compliance that the Chinese authorities required. The Estée Lauder approach was primarily in the third category, which was commercially rational and ethically uncomfortable, in a way that the company's public communications were never quite able to fully resolve. The gap between what the cruelty-free labels communicated and what the broader corporate operations involved was real, and it was visible to the consumers who looked carefully enough to see it. This is not a problem that has a clean solution, which is perhaps why the corporate communications around it tended toward a certain careful imprecision. The company could and did make distinctions. The animal testing required by Chinese regulators was performed by third-party laboratories as a regulatory compliance measure, not as an internal product development practice. The cruelty-free commitments of specific brands related to their own development processes, not to what foreign regulators required of imported products. These distinctions were real. They were also, from the perspective of a consumer who bought a product specifically because of a cruelty-free label and then discovered the corporate parent was selling in a market that required animal testing, not entirely satisfying. The label said one thing. The broader supply chain said something more complicated. The gap between those two statements was the ethical problem, and it was one that the company addressed with the specific kind of nuance that organizations use when they are trying to maintain two incompatible commitments simultaneously, which is to say, not entirely successfully. The Chinese regulations have evolved in subsequent years, with a regulatory reform process that created pathways for certain categories of cosmetics to be sold without mandatory pre-market animal testing, and the company has engaged with this process actively. This is genuinely positive. It is also worth noting that the engagement with regulatory reform came after years during which the company was fully aware of the tension and was continuing to operate in both markets simultaneously. Whether the regulatory reform advocacy was primarily motivated by ethical concern or by the commercial inconvenience of maintaining two incompatible brand positions is a question that the company's internal deliberations, which are not publicly available, would be needed to answer definitively. From the outside, the most honest answer is probably that it was both, in proportions that varied depending on who at the company you were asking. The boycotts that have periodically targeted the company over Ronald Lauder's public activities represent a different category of ethical question, one that sits at the intersection of personal political activity, corporate association, and the increasingly contested relationship between consumer politics and commercial brands. Ronald Lauder has been a prominent and public supporter of Israel and of specifically Israeli institutional and political causes throughout his adult life. This is a position he holds personally and has expressed through his philanthropic and organizational work, including his role at the World Jewish Congress. It is also a position that has made him a visible target for the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, and for various pro-Palestinian activist organizations, some of which have called for boycotts of Estée Lauder Company's products as a form of pressure on the family. The question this raises for the company is genuinely difficult, and not because the answer should be obvious, but precisely because it should not. Ronald Lauder is a private individual whose political views and activities are his own. He is also a member of the family that controls the company, whose name appears on the products. Whether his personal political commitments should carry commercial consequences for the company is a question about which reasonable people hold genuinely different positions. The organizations calling for boycotts argue that the family's control of the company means that revenue from its products contributes to the resources that fund Ronald's activities. The company's position is that it is a business, not a political actor, and that its employees and operations in the relevant regions reflect its genuine commitments to the people who work for it and the markets it serves. Neither of these positions is entirely without merit, and the gap between them is not one that any statement, however carefully drafted, is going to close. What the boycott controversy reveals is something broader about the current moment in consumer capitalism, which is that the separation between a company and the individuals who control it has become harder to maintain as a matter of consumer perception, even as it remains technically accurate as a matter of legal structure. Consumers who care about where their money ultimately flows are making rational choices to consider the full picture of who benefits from their purchases. Whether that logic applies most usefully to beauty products in this specific case is debatable, but the underlying instinct to think about the second-order effects of commercial decisions is not an unreasonable one, and dismissing it as naive misses the legitimate concern that is generating it. The feminist critique of the beauty industry is perhaps the oldest and most philosophically interesting of the ethical questions surrounding the Estée Lauder story, because it targets not the specific practices of the company, but the foundational logic of the business it is in. The argument, made with varying degrees of sophistication by critics from the late 1960s onward, is that the beauty industry as a whole operates by exploiting the gap between how women feel about their appearance and how they believe their appearance should be, and that this gap is not natural but is actively maintained and widened by the industry itself. The basic structure of beauty marketing involves identifying a deficiency, naming it, and offering a product that addresses it. The deficiency could be wrinkles or uneven skin tone, or insufficient moisture, or inadequate definition of various features. Whatever it is presented as a problem, and the problem generates a market. Estée Lauder, in this reading, is not simply a business that sold products women wanted. It is a business that cultivated the wanting by cultivating the inadequacy that the wanting was supposed to address. The woman at the mirror in Queens, who watched her mother transform herself every morning, was absorbing not only the lesson that appearance was a tool, but also the lesson that her natural appearance, the face she woke up with, was not the face she should present to the world. That gap between the face you have and the face you're supposed to have is where the beauty industry lives, and the Estée Lauder brand, with its specific aspirational positioning, its association with transformation and refinement, was a particularly sophisticated operator in that gap. This critique is not wrong. It is also not the complete picture. The women who used Estée Lauder products were not passive victims of manufactured inadequacy. Many of them derived genuine pleasure from the ritual of skincare, genuine confidence from appearing at their best by their own definition of best, and genuine practical benefit from products that did what they claimed. The enjoyment of beauty rituals is real and does not require external justification. The desire to present a polished version of yourself to the world is not inherently a sign of internalized self-rejection. These things can all be true simultaneously. The industry can exploit insecurity, individual consumers can genuinely enjoy their products, and the relationship between the two can be complicated rather than simple. Acknowledging the exploitation does not require concluding that every purchaser was a victim, and acknowledging the genuine enjoyment does not require concluding that the industry's structural incentives were benign. Estée herself embodied this complexity in a particularly direct way. She believed in the products. She believed that looking good was a form of respect for yourself and for the people around you, a belief that is either empowering or oppressive depending on how firmly it is held and how much pressure it applies. She also built a business model that depended on women never quite feeling they had arrived at the version of themselves the products were promising to produce. This is not a paradox unique to Estée Lauder. It is the paradox of the beauty industry as a whole. But she was a particularly clear example of it, because the personal conviction and the commercial logic were so explicitly aligned in her case. The issue of John Schatz, addressed in detail earlier in this story, sits in a slightly different ethical category, because it involves a specific person who was demonstrably deprived of recognition and presumably compensation for work that formed the foundation of a major commercial enterprise. The broader ethical questions above are systemic. They describe problems with an industry and with a model of doing business. The Schatz question is personal. One man's contribution was erased, and the erasure benefited one family enormously while apparently benefiting him not at all. The company has never, in any public statement, addressed this. The silence is its own kind of answer. What these various ethical threads have in common is that they all exist within the structure of a business that was built through genuine skill, genuine product quality, and genuine innovation. This is the frustrating thing about moral complexity at scale. The positive and the problematic are not neatly separated. They are woven together in the same operation, by the same decisions, serving the same commercial purposes. The animal testing compromise and the cruelty-free brand acquisition are not two separate stories. They are one story about a company trying to maintain multiple commitments in a world that does not always permit them to coexist comfortably. The feminist critique and the genuine pleasure of the products are not two separate truths. They are aspects of the same complicated relationship between women and beauty that the industry both reflects and shapes. This is not ultimately a story about a company that was good or bad. It is a story about a company that was consequential, which is a different thing. Consequential things are rarely simple. They are built from compromises and insights and genuine genius and moral imprecision, assembled over time by people who were doing their best in the light of what they could see from where they stood. Estée Lauder could not see, from where she stood in 1948, everything that the empire she was beginning to build would eventually do and be and compromise. Neither can we, looking back, extract a clean judgment from the complexity of what she built. We can note the complexity, name the problems, and acknowledge that the problems do not cancel the achievements any more than the achievements excuse the problems. That is probably the most honest thing that can be said about a 70-year commercial empire built by one extraordinarily driven woman from a converted restaurant kitchen in New York. It was extraordinary, and it was compromised. Both things are true. The question of which one matters more is one that each person watching this story will answer differently, and that is exactly as it should be. What remains, after the questions are asked and the complexity is acknowledged, is the scale of what was built, and the scale is genuinely staggering if you let yourself think about it properly. Start where we started. 4 products made in a repurposed kitchen by a woman who had no formal training in business or chemistry, selling them personally, one face at a time, to women in beauty salons and at social events in mid-century New York. The operation was, by any conventional measure, tiny. The ambition behind it was not. By the time Estée Lauder died in 2004 at the age of 95, the company that bore her name had revenues measured in the billions. The portfolio had grown to include more than 25 brands. The distribution spanned more than 150 countries. The workforce numbered in the tens of thousands. The counters in department stores around the world were a standard feature of the prestige beauty landscape in a way that made it difficult to remember, or even fully believe, that they had not always been there. The Estée Lauder counter, with its specific aesthetic and its specific approach to the customer interaction, had become so embedded in the shared experience of the beauty-buying public that it functioned as a kind of institution, the way that certain other things become institutions through sheer duration and ubiquity. You stop thinking about where they came from because they seem always to have been there. The company reached carbon neutrality in 2020, which was a milestone of a different kind than its commercial achievements. A demonstration that the organization was capable of setting an environmental standard and meeting it, at a scale that involved supply chains and manufacturing facilities and retail operations across more than 100 countries. This is not a simple thing to accomplish. It requires the kind of organizational coordination and sustained commitment that would be impressive from any company, and is particularly notable from one that had, in its early decades, operated with no environmental framework at all, because no such framework existed and the industry was not asking for one. The 2020 milestone does not erase the decades of environmental footprint that preceded it. It does represent a genuine organizational achievement that belongs in the account of what this company has been capable of when it decided to do something. The acquisition of Tom Ford in 2022 for approximately $2.8 billion was the largest acquisition in the company's history and represented a significant strategic bet on the continuing vitality of the ultra-luxury segment. Tom Ford, the brand, had been one of the most successful luxury fashion and beauty brands of the 21st century, built around an aesthetic of confident, slightly transgressive glamour that was in some ways a contemporary version of the aspirational positioning that Estée had pioneered in a different register decades earlier. The acquisition brought the company into direct competition with the major European luxury conglomerates, in a segment where the financial metrics were extraordinary: margins, brand loyalty, and pricing power, all at the upper end of what the consumer goods industry produces. It was also a purchase that came at a time when the company was navigating post-pandemic challenges in its core business, which made the price tag notable. Whether the bet pays off over the time frame that makes a $2.8 billion acquisition, rationale will be visible in the company's performance over the years ahead. The opening of a global fragrance atelier in Paris in 2024, incorporating artificial intelligence into the perfume development process, was a different kind of signal. It represented the company's engagement with a set of technologies that were reshaping every creative and commercial industry, applied to the specific craft of perfumery, which is one of the oldest and most human-scale creative disciplines that exists. The combination is either the future or a peculiar category error, depending on your relationship to the idea of machine intelligence, participating in the creation of something as intimate and sensory as a fragrance. The atelier's existence reflects at minimum that the company understands it is operating in a world where standing still is not an option, and where the definition of what the beauty industry does and how it does it is being renegotiated in real time. The central paradox of the Estée Lauder story, the one that persists through every phase and every chapter of what has been covered here, is this. The woman who built one of the most powerful consumer brands in history did it by being, in every dimension of her public life, exactly what she had decided to be rather than what she actually was. She was Josephine Menzer, who became Estée Lauder. She was a girl from Queens who became a supposed countess. She was the daughter of an immigrant hardware store owner who became a fixture in the social world of people who had never had to worry about hardware stores. She used someone else's formulas to build a brand celebrated for its proprietary expertise. She sold transformation while undergoing the most complete transformation in the story. She persuaded women that they needed what she was offering while being, herself, the clearest proof that the need was real, that the gap between who you are and who you decide to become is a genuine space that genuine effort can genuinely close. This is either an inspiring story or a cautionary one, and the answer to which it is depends on which thread you follow and how far you follow it. If you follow the thread of what she built, you find a story of remarkable ambition, remarkable skill, and a series of commercial insights that reshaped an entire industry in ways that are still visible in every department store beauty floor on Earth. If you follow the thread of what she obscured in building it, you find a more complicated story of erasure and invention, and the specific moral costs of choosing to be whatever you needed to be in order to get where you intended to go. The industry she left behind is not the industry she found. When Josephine Menzer was learning to mix creams in her uncle's laboratory in the 1920s, the prestige beauty market was a relatively small collection of European houses and American upstarts, selling products through department store counters to a consumer base that was only beginning to understand itself as a market. The market she helped create is global, diversified, valued in the hundreds of billions, and organized around a set of practices, the gift with purchase, the personal counter demonstration, the multi-brand portfolio, the premium distribution model that she either invented or popularized from the ground up. Her competitors were different because of what she did. Her successors were building on what she built. The industry carried her methods in its bones, whether it credited her or not. The woman who stood at a mirror in a queen's apartment and watched her mother turn herself into someone else every morning understood something that took the world considerably longer to articulate, that the self is a thing you make, not a thing you are given, and that the making of it is serious work that deserves to be taken seriously. She took it seriously. She took it seriously for 95 years, with a consistency and a discipline that is, whatever else you think about the specific choices she made, genuinely impressive. Josephine Menzer became Estée Lauder. The world of beauty was never quite the same afterward. The world of business was not either. That is the story. It is the story of one woman who refused to accept the limitations the world had assigned to her and built something that outlasted every argument that it was impossible. It is also the story of what that refusal cost and who paid the parts of the cost she did not pay herself. Both of those stories are real. Both of them belong here. The complexity is the point. The Tom Ford acquisition also brought the company something it had not previously had at the ultra-luxury level, a brand with a clearly defined, assertive masculine identity that operated without apology in the territory of overt glamour. Tom Ford's menswear and grooming lines had redefined what luxury male grooming could look like, and the contrast with Aramis, which launched 60 years earlier into a market that needed its beauty products disguised as professional tools, is a measure of how much the acceptable range of male self-presentation had expanded over those 6 decades. Aramis was packaging beauty as practicality for a market uncomfortable with the category. Tom Ford was packaging beauty as power for a market that had made its peace with the category and was now primarily interested in the quality and the statement. Both launches were, in their respective moments, accurate readings of what the market was ready for. The distance between them tells you something about how much that market had changed, and the company's acquisition of Tom Ford suggests it understood where the next phase of that change was pointing. The feminist critique of the beauty industry also deserves one more layer of examination, because the current moment has added dimensions to it that were not available to the critics of the 1970s and 1980s. The rise of social media and its particular relationship to appearance has intensified the dynamics that the beauty industry has always operated within. The gap between how people look in ordinary life and how they look in the curated images that now constitute a significant portion of social experience is wider and more constantly visible than anything that existed in the era of Estée's active salesmanship. The insecurity that beauty marketing has always required and reinforced is now ambient in a way it was not before. Whether the Estée Lauder companies and the industry it helped shape bears responsibility for this evolution is a question that is easier to ask than to answer. The industry did not invent social media. It did not invent the curated self-presentation that social media runs on. But it has spent decades cultivating the relationship between appearance and self-worth that social media has turbocharged, and it is not entirely removed from the consequences of that cultivation. What would Estée herself have made of the world the industry she built now operates in? The question is unanswerable, but interesting. She was, throughout her life, genuinely optimistic about what beauty products could do for women, and genuinely persuaded that the experience of looking and feeling your best was a form of self-respect rather than self-exploitation. She would probably have found the current critique somewhat beside the point. She would also probably have been extraordinary on social media. The personal selling method, the individual attention, the demonstration and the follow-up, all of it translates with suspicious ease to the mechanics of influence marketing and tutorial content and the personal relationship between creator and audience that drives conversion in the current digital environment. She was doing something structurally similar in beauty salons in 1942. The tools are different. The method would have been immediately recognizable to her. The scale of what was built from those 1942 beginnings remains, even after everything that has been examined in this story, the most astonishing single fact about it. 4 products. A borrowed kitchen. One woman with an unusual level of conviction about the relationship between appearance and possibility. 70 years later, more than 25 brands, revenue measured in the tens of billions, operations across more than 150 countries, and a name that is recognized in contexts so far removed from its corona, Queen's origins, that the distance between those 2 points on the map almost defies comprehension. Almost. The distance is comprehensible, barely, if you're willing to follow every step that was taken to cross it, including the ones that went sideways and the ones that went in directions that were not always admirable. The comprehensibility is the point. It was done by a person, not by a force of nature, and that means it was the product of decisions, and decisions can be examined, and the examination reveals both the genius and the cost, in roughly equal measure, which is how most important things actually work. The company that exists today is not the company that Estée built. It is the company that was built on top of what she built, through decades of decisions made by people who understood what she had started well enough to continue it, and occasionally well enough to improve it. Leonard extended the distribution and formalized the brand architecture. Ronald carried the family name into public life in ways that had nothing to do with skincare and everything to do with the kind of presence in the world that Estée had always wanted the family to have. The grandchildren who hold positions in the organization carry a legacy that is both an extraordinary advantage and a set of expectations that no inheritance can fully prepare someone to meet. They are stewards of something that was created before they were born and that will outlast most of the decisions they make. That is an unusual relationship to have with your work, and it requires an unusual kind of commitment to something larger than any individual contribution. The story of the counter experience, the personal demonstration, the gift with purchase, the multi-brand portfolio, the distribution model that refused to go anywhere the brand did not belong, the fragrance that let women buy themselves something without needing a special occasion, the invented persona that carried real genius inside it. All of these threads run through the entirety of what was built and remain visible in how the industry operates today. The beauty business, as it exists in the 3rd decade of the 21st century, owes a measurable debt to the decisions made by one woman who had no formal training in any of the relevant disciplines and compensated for the lack of formal training with an absolutely extraordinary capacity for observation, adaptation, and sustained effort. That is the legacy. Not the number of countries, not the stock price, not the list of acquisitions. The legacy is the method, and the method is still running, in department stores and online platforms and beauty counters and personal selling interactions all over the world, in forms that Estée Lauder would recognize instantly if she could see them, because they are in every essential respect hers,